Chapter 8. Minutes after the bell began its somber tolling, someone tapped on Talia's door. Before Karen could answer, Skiff stuck his head inside. Karen lowered the blade she had aimed reflexively at the entrance.
"Karen,"
Skiff said hesitantly,
"your brother sent me. He thought you might want to be with the others. I can watch Talia."
Karen pulled herself together with an obvious effort.
"You sure? I know you think you're good, youngling."
Talia didn't even notice Skiff's hand moving, but suddenly there was a knife quivering in the wall not an inch from Karen's nose. Both of them stared at it in surprise.
"Huh,"
was all the reply Karen made.
"If there had been a fly on your beak, I could have nipped it off without touching you,"
Skiff said soberly, with none of his usual boastfulness.
"I know I've got a long way to go and everything else, but not even Ulbrich can best me with these."
He held up his right hand, with a dagger that matched the first in it.
"Anybody who tries forcing their way in here is going to have to get around 6 inches of steel in his throat." "I'll take your word for it."
Karen rose and sheathed her sword.
"You may regret this, because I'll probably arrange for you to share Talia watch from now on. So, I volunteered, but Ilsa wouldn't take me seriously. Well, I will."
She passed him, waving him into the room.
"And, youngling, thanks. You've got a good heart."
Skiff just shrugged and pulled his knife out of the wall.
"What's going on?"
Talia whispered hoarsely.
"What's the death bell?"
Skiff perched himself cross-legged on the top of her desk. His expression was unwontedly serious.
"What do you want answered first?"
"The bell."
"All right. Since I don't know what you know, I'll take it from the beginning. There used to be a little temple in the grove in Companion's Field. King Valdemar had it put up. It had a bell tower, but not until just before he died was there a bell in it. The bell was actually installed the day before he died, but the rope to ring it hadn't been hung, and it didn't have a clapper. So you can imagine that, when a strange bell was heard tolling before dawn the next morning, people were pretty startled. When they went out to look, they saw what you'd see now if you were to go out to the field. Every companion here gathered around the tower and staring at it. When they got back to the palace, they learned what the heralds had already known, that Valdemar was dead. The temple's long gone, but the tower is still there, and every time a herald dies, the death bell tolls.
"And Karen?"
"Every herald knows when another one dies, and whether or not it was from natural causes. You sort of start to get the sensing of it around about your 3rd year, sooner if your gift is strong. I haven't got it yet. It hurts, they tell me, like something of yourself has died. The ones with the strongest gifts may know details of what happened. You always know who, if you're a full herald, and a little of how, as soon as a bell begins to ring. Most of them find it easier to be together for a while, especially if it was someone they knew really well. That's why Herald Terran sent me. Beltran was one of Karen's yearmates."
There wasn't much Talia could say in reply. She and Skiff stared gloomily out the windows for a long time, listening to the bell. The tolling that sounded like the cold iron was sobbing. Word on what had actually befallen Beltran did not reach the Collegium for several days. When news came, it was not good. Someone or something had ambushed him and sent both Beltran and his companion over the edge of a cliff. There were no clues as to who the murderer was, and if the Queen knew why it had happened, she kept her own counsel. The atmosphere became more desolate and oppressive with every passing day. Talia's newly awakened sensitivity left her painfully aware of it, and the weakness she was prey to as she recovered did not make bearing the brunt of this easy. Skiff, who, true to Karen's threat, was now sharing guard duty with the 3 adults, did his best to cheer her with collegium gossip and more of his absurd stories, but even he could not completely counteract the effect of the mourning of all those around her. Finally, the Queen gave orders, and the heralds flew like the arrows they were named for to obey. Talia never did hear details, but the murderer was caught, though not even the news that he had been found and condemned by Queen and Council did anything to ease the atmosphere of pain, for Beltran had been universally held in high regard by the members of the Circle. The entirety of the Collegium, as well as those of the Circle at court, assembled for the memorial service several weeks later. As was all too often the case, there was no body to bury, and the service was held at the single pillar that held the names of all those heralds who had sacrificed themselves for monarch and kingdom. Talia had only just been allowed to leave her bed, but something impelled her to beg the healer Devon to permit her to attend the memorial. Impressed by the urgency she was obviously feeling, he overrode his own better judgment and agreed that she should be allowed to go. She had not confided how strongly she was being affected by the mourning about her to anyone yet. She had been hoping that Karen had been right and it would go away. And having been accused of having an overactive imagination more than once, she couldn't be entirely sure how much of this she might be conjuring out of her own mind. Nothing of the ceremony was any too clear in her mind. Everything seemed to be washed away in a flood of sadness and loss. She stood through it in a fog of pain, sure only now that she was in no way inflicting any of this on herself. When those assembled had begun dispersing, a locus of agony sharpened and defined. It was the Queen. Talia had not been this close to Selene since her first day at the Collegium. She would not have dared to disturb her except that the Queen's emotional turmoil drew on her with an irresistible attraction. She approached shyly, as quietly as she could.
"Your Majesty,"
she said hesitantly.
"It's Talia."
"I sent him to his death," Selene replied, as if in answer to some internal question. "I knew what I was sending him into, and I sent him anyway. I murdered him, just as surely as if it had been my hand that pushed him to his death." The pain and self-accusation of the Queen's words triggered something within Talia, something that impelled her to reply,
"Why are you trying to convince yourself that he didn't know the kind of danger he was in?"
she said, knowing that her own words were nothing less than the stark truth, but not knowing how she knew.
"He was fully aware, and he went despite that knowledge. He wasn't expecting to die, but he knew it was a possibility. Majesty, we all know it can happen, and at any time. You had no choice either. Wasn't it absolutely imperative that someone be sent?"
"Yes,"
the word came reluctantly.
"And wasn't he the best, perhaps the only herald for the task?"
"He was the only herald with any hope of convincing the people of the area to part with the information I needed. He worked as my agent there for 3 years, and they knew and trusted him."
"And did he not succeed in sending you that information? Was there any substitute for it?"
"What he sent to me will save us a war," Selene sighed. "Even among rulers, blackmail sometimes works wonders, and I'll blackmail Relnathar with a cheerful heart if it will keep him off our borders and within his own. Lady knows I'd tried every other way to get it."
"Then you had no choice at all. You acted for the good of all our people. It's the kind of decision that you and only you can make. Majesty, in orientation class, they told me in good plain terms that it is quite likely that a herald will perish, perhaps horribly, before he ever has to think of retiring because of age. They tell everyone that, but it's never stopped anyone from becoming a herald. It's something we have to do, just as making hard choices is something you have to do. And behind all of it, I think, is that we all have to choose to do what we know to be right, You as queen, the rest of us as your heralds. I know if Beltran could be standing here right at this moment, he'd tell you that the choice you made was the only one you could have made." The queen stared at Talia, her eyes bright with unshed tears, but Talia could feel the agony within her easing. "Child," she said slowly, "you very nearly perished yourself because of my actions, or lack of them. Can you stand there and tell me you would have been glad to die?"
"No," Talia said frankly. "I was awfully afraid. I didn't want to die, and I still don't. But if it happens, it happens. I made the choice to become a herald, and if I knew I was going to die tomorrow, I still wouldn't choose otherwise."
"Oh, Talia, child."
The queen sat abruptly on the side of the memorial, and Talia hesitantly touched her, then sat beside her and put one arm around her shoulders, feeling odd and a little awkward, and yet impelled to do so nevertheless. It was apparently the correct action, as Selene suddenly relaxed long enough to shed a few bitter tears, allowing herself the brief luxury of leaning on a strength outside her own.
"How have you become so wise so young?" she said at last, composing herself. "Not even a year at the collegium, yet truly Queen's Own. Talimir would approve of you, I think."
She rose gracefully, her face once again a serene mask. Talia sensed that, while she still mourned, the burden of guilt had been lifted from her shoulders.
"But you are not yet well, little one, and I see your keepers looking for you. And I must face the ambassador of Kasi, and dance in diplomatic circles about him until he knows with absolute certainty that I have the proof of his lord's double dealings. Thank you, Queen's Own."
She turned and walked swiftly back to the palace as Karen and Terran approached.
"When you didn't come back with the rest, we began to worry," Terran half scolded. "Healer Devon wants you back in bed." "You look like someone forced you through a sieve, lovey," Karen observed. "What's wrong?"
"The queen. She was so guilty feeling, so unhappy. I could feel it, and I had to do something about it."
"So, you went to talk to her." Karen nodded with satisfaction at her twin. "All the right words just seemed to flow from you, right?"
"How did you guess?"
"Lovey, that's what makes you Queen's Own, and the rest of us ordinary heralds. Grandfather used to claim he never knew what he was going to say to the king beforehand, yet it was always exactly the right thing. Trust those instincts."
"Grandfather?"
Talia asked in a daze.
"Talimir was our grandfather," Terran explained. "I think he secretly hoped one of us would succeed him." "Well, I didn't," Karen replied firmly. "After seeing the kind of hell he went through, I wouldn't have the job under any circumstances. I don't envy you, Talia, not at all." "I agree," Terran nodded. "Talia, you still look a bit wobbly. Will you be all right now?"
"I think so,"
she said slowly, beginning to feel a bit better now that the overwhelming burden of the sorrows of the rest of the heralds was dissipating.
"Let's get you back to your room, then, and I'll have a little talk with Dean Elkarth. If nothing else, we should show you how to shield yourself so you don't take on more of other people's feelings than you can handle. If your gift hasn't faded by now, it's not going to," Karen said, as her twin nodded his agreement.
Karen stayed with her until Elkarth arrived, then left the two of them alone. Talia sat carefully on the edge of her chair, concentrating on what Elkarth had to say, afraid she might miss something vital. She was beginning to think she couldn't bear much more of this business of carrying other people's emotions and thoughts around inside of her. If there was a way to stop it from happening, she most devoutedly wanted to learn it. But this shielding was a simple trick to learn, for which Talia was very grateful.
"Think of a wall,"
Elkarth told her.
"A wall, all around you, and between you and everyone else. See it, and feel it, and believe that nothing and no one can reach you through it."
Talia concentrated with all her strength, and for the first time in days she felt a blessed sense of relief from the pressure of minds around her. With its lessening, her own confidence in the shield grew, and the shield grew stronger in response. At last Elkarth was satisfied that nothing could penetrate what she had built, and left her to her own devices.
"Don't ever hesitate to drop it, though," the Dean urged her. "Especially if you suspect danger. Your gift may give you the best warning you're likely to get."
Talia made a thoughtful gesture of acquiescence, thinking how, if she'd been able to detect the maliciousness of her tormentors, she'd have been warned enough to have gotten help with them long before things had come to so nearly fatal a conclusion. A few days later, the healer pronounced her fit, and she returned to her normal round of classes. Outwardly, her life seemed little different, yet there were some profound changes. The first thing that had changed was her bond with Rolan. It was so much stronger now than it had been before the river incident that there was no comparison. She discovered this not long after she had learned how to shield out the emotions of others. She was sitting in a quiet corner of the library. She had just finished her book and had closed it with a feeling of satisfaction, as it was one of the histories that concluded on a positive note. There wasn't enough time for her to start a new book before the next class, so she was simply sitting for a moment with her eyes closed, letting her mind wander where it would. Almost inevitably, it wandered toward Rolan. Suddenly, she was seeing a corner of Companion's Field, but her view was curiously flat and distorted. There seemed to be a blind spot straight ahead of her. Her peripheral vision was doubled, and she seemed to be several inches higher than she actually stood. There was that feeling of slight disorientation that she had come to associate with seeing through the eyes and memories of others. Then, a start of surprise, followed by an outpouring of love and welcome. It was then that she realized that she was sharing Rolan's thoughts. From that moment on, she had only to think briefly of him to know exactly where he was and what he was doing, and if she closed her eyes, she could even see what he was seeing. Thoughts and images, though never words, flowed between them constantly. An emotion so profound it transcended every meaning Talia had ever heard attached to the word love tied them together now, and she understood how it was that heralds and their companions so seldom survived one another when death broke that bond that held them together. It was shortly after this that her relationship with the Queen underwent a similarly abrupt change. Selene had sought the sanctuary of the barren gardens, a place where, with the last of winter still upon them, it was unlikely that she would be disturbed. Talia had found herself pulled inexorably to those same gardens. On seeing the Queen pacing the paths, she understood why. "Majesty," she called out softly. Selene shaded her eyes against the weak afternoon sunlight and smiled when she saw who it was that had called her. "Another lover of desolation? I thought I was the only person who found dead gardens attractive. But the potential is here for more. You only have to look ahead to what will be in the spring," Talia pointed out, falling into step beside the Queen. "It's not so much desolate and dead here as it is dormant. It's just a matter of seeing the possibilities." Seeing the possibilities. Long-term instead of immediacy. Selene became very thoughtful, then began to brighten visibly. "Yes, that's it exactly. Little one, you've done it again, and I have to get back to the council. Thank you." She strode rapidly away, leaving Talia to wonder just what it was that she'd done. But as time passed, such incidents became more and more commonplace. And as winter became spring, it was less often the case that Talia sought the Queen's company, as it was the other way around. Selene actively hunted her out at irregular intervals. They would talk together, sometimes for hours, sometimes only for a moment or two. Talia would find the words to express the things she knew, somehow, that the Queen needed to hear, and Selene would take her leave, comforted or energized. Talia often thought of herself, with no little bewilderment, as two people. One, the ordinary, everyday Talia, no more wise than the next half-grown adolescent. The other, some incredibly knowledgeable and ancient being who only manifested herself in Selene's presence. With this assumption of her duty as Queen's own, Talia was reminded of yet another. The apparent reason that Rolan had chosen her, after all, was because she was supposedly the one person who could civilize the brat. Yet in all this time she had seen Elspeth only once, and that when she had first arrived. It was true that until now she had been too busy adjusting herself to the collegium to have any time or emotional energy to spare for dealing with the child. Still, that wasn't the case anymore. It was definitely time to do something about the heir presumptive.
"Glory! What a long face!"
Skiff exclaimed, plopping himself down in the chair next to Talia in the library, and earning himself a black look or two for disturbing the silence from the trainees sitting nearby.
"What's the matter? Or should I not ask?"
he continued with less volume.
"It's the brat. I'm supposed to be doing something about her, but I can't get anywhere near her,"
Talia replied with gloom and self-disgust.
"Oh, so. And what's keeping you away?"
"Her nurse, I think. The foreigner, Hulda. I haven't once seen the old one. I can't prove anything, though. She seems very conscientious, the very model of respect and cooperation. Yet somehow, whenever I try to get anywhere near the child, she's there too, with something Elspeth absolutely has to be doing right that very moment. And it's all very logical, all quite correct. It's just that it's happened too many times now."
"Once is chance, twice is coincidence," Skiff quoted. "But 3 times is conspiracy. Has it gotten to the conspiracy stage yet?"
"It got to that point a long time ago, but I can't see how I can prove it, or where everything fits in."
He bounded to his feet and tapped her nose with an outstretched finger.
"You just leave the proving it to good old sneaky Skiff. And as for figuring out how everything fits together, I should think Herald Jadis would be the best source for information. He's been stuck here at the Collegium since the Tedral Wars were over. The servants tell him everything, and he's got the thought-sensing gift to boot. If anyone would know the pieces of the puzzle that go back forever, he would. So ask him. You see him every night."
"I never thought of Jadis," Talia replied, beginning to smile. "But, Skiff, is this likely to get you into trouble?"
"Only if I get caught, in which case I'll have a good story ready, and you'd better be ready to back me up."
"But—"
"Never you mind, but. Life's been too quiet around here. Nothing to get my blood stirred up. Besides, I don't intend to do this for nothing, you know. You owe me, lady-o."
"Skiff," she replied unthinkingly, "if you can help me prove what I suspect, you can name your reward."
"Thank you,"
he grinned, waggling his bushy eyebrows in what he obviously thought was a lascivious fashion, but which fell a lot closer to absurdity.
"I'll do just that."
Talia succeeded in sparing his feelings by smothering her laughter as he bounced jauntily out.
"Elspeth's nurse?"
Jadis was so startled by Talia's question that he actually set my lady down.
"Talia, why in the name of the 9 would old Melody want to keep you away from Elspeth?"
"It's not Melody that's doing it. It's the other one," Talia replied. "Hulda. Melody really doesn't seem to do very much, actually. She mostly just knits and nods. Hulda seems to be the one giving all the orders."
"That puts another complexion on things entirely,"
Jadis mused.
"Youngling, how much do you know about the current situation? The background, I should say."
"Not one thing. Well, almost nothing. Selene told me that her marriage with Elspeth's father wasn't a good one, and that she felt that a lot of Elspeth's bratliness is due to her own neglect. And since nobody mentions him, I supposed her husband was either dead or vanished, or banished. That's about all.
In that case, I'd better tell you, starting from the Tedral War. That was when Selene's father was killed.
That was at least 15 years ago, wasn't it?
Just about. All right. Carsey intended to overrun us without actually declaring war. They hired the entire nation of Tedral mercenaries to do their dirty work for them. The king was killed just as the last battle was won, and if I'd just been a little more agile, he'd still be alive.
He sighed, and guilt washed briefly over his features.
Well, I wasn't. Selene had only just completed her internship when the war broke out. She was duly crowned, completed the work of mopping up the last of the Tedral, and settled down to rule. As was to be expected, anyone of rank with a younger son to dispose of sent him to the court. One of those visiting sons was Prince Carathanelan.
With a name like that, he could only have been from Rethwalan. Jadis smiled.
They are rather fond of mouth-filling nominatives, aren't they? He was indeed. He was also almost impossibly handsome, cultured, intelligent. Selene was instantly infatuated, and there was nothing anyone could say that would make her change her mind about him. They were wedded less than a month after he'd first arrived. The trouble began soon after that.
Why should there have been trouble?
Because he wanted something Selene could never by law give him. The throne. Had he been chosen, he could have reigned as equal consort, but no companion would have anything to do with him. Selene's Cario even kicked him once, as I recall. He had brought a number of landless, titled friends with him, and the Lord knows we have unclaimed territory enough, so Selene had granted them estates. He didn't see why she couldn't just as easily give him rank, at least equal with hers.
But why didn't he understand? I mean, everyone knows the law is the law for everybody.
Except that, out kingdom, the monarch's word frequently is the law. He wouldn't or couldn't accept that such is not the case here. When he couldn't get what he wanted by gift, he began scheming to take it by force, under the mistaken assumption that it was his right to do so.
Talia shook her head in disbelief.
At any rate, he and his friends, and even some of our own people, began plotting a way to remove Selene and set him in her place. And, to allay any suspicions, he reconciled with Selene and had his own nurse travel here to help Melody with Elspeth. I don't think that his intention was to kill Selene. I really do believe he only intended to hold her until she agreed to abdicate in his favour or Elspeth's with him as regent. I do know for a fact that his friends were far more ruthless. Their intention was assassination, and they planned it for when Selene was alone, exercising Cario. It might have worked, too, except for Alberic's gift.
Alberic has a gift? I never guessed. Jadis nodded.
It's hard to think of Alberic as a herald, isn't it?
It is, Talia confessed. He doesn't wear whites. I scarcely ever see Cantor, with or without him. And that accent in the way he acts, he's so strange. Where is he from, anyway? Nobody ever told me.
Carsey,
Jadis said to her surprise.
Which is why you'll never hear a herald use that old saying, The only things that come out of Carse are bad weather and brigands. He was a captain in their army, the youngest ever to hold that rank, or so I'm told. Unfortunately for him, though not for us, his gift, when it works, is very powerful. It caused him to slip a time or two too often, to seem to know far more than he should have, especially about the future. His own people, his own company of the army, were hunting him as a witch because of that. They had him cornered in a burning barn when Cantor galloped through the flames to save him. Well, that's another story, and you should ask him to tell it to you sometime. The pertinent thing to this story is that Ulbricht's gift is foresight. Without telling Selene why, he insisted on accompanying her, along with a dozen of his best pupils. Every one of the ambushers was killed. Among them was the prince. The official story is that he was killed in a hunting accident along with his friends.
I suppose that's marginally true. They were hunting Selene.
Jadis grimaced.
Child, you have a macabre sense of humor.
But didn't his own people have anything to say about such a flimsy tale?
They might have, except that circumstances had changed. As it happened, their king had since died, and the prince's brother was reigning, and there had been no love lost between the two of them. The new king knew what his power-hungry sibling was like, and was just as pleased that the scandal was shoved beneath the rug so neatly. Well, after that, Selene was kept very busy in attempting to ferret out those conspirators who hadn't actually been among the ambushers, and to tell you the truth, I still don't think she's found all of them. I'll tell you now what I've suspected for some time. Talia was murdered because he was about to propose to the council that Elspeth be fostered out to some of his remote relations. They were isolated folk of very minor noble rank. They weren't going to put up with any nonsense from a child, and they were isolated enough that there was no chance Elspeth would be able to run away. But they are stubborn folk, and Talia was the only one likely to be able to persuade them to take the brat on, and when he died, the plan was given up. But that all came later, after Selene had been so busy that she had very little time to spare for Elspeth. Up until 2 years ago, none of us had any inkling of trouble. We just turned around one day, and the sweet, tractable child had become the royal brat.
What's all this got to do with Hulda?
That is something I can't tell you. I'd been under the impression that it was Melody who was in charge of the nursery, but from what you've observed, that doesn't seem to be the case. That's exceedingly disturbing, since I would have bet any amount of money that Melody was the equal of anyone, up to and including Ulbricht. I can't picture her just handing everything over to a foreigner.
Something's changed drastically then, Talia mused. And it looks like it's up to me to find out what.
I fear so, youngling.
Jadis sighed, seeing the determination in her eyes.
I fear so.
Another change in Talia's life was in the way the other students treated her. Hitherto they had assumed Talia's reticence was due to a wish for privacy, and had honored that wish. Now that they knew it was simply due to shyness, they went out of their way to include her in their gossip and pranks. Sessions in the sewing room were no longer a time for Talia to hide behind a mound of mending. The change was signaled one afternoon when there were no boys sharing the task. Nerissa was the current target of teasing about her most recent amorous conquest. She was being quite good-humored about it, but the jibes were getting a little tiresome. She looked around for a possible victim to switch the attention to, and her eye lighted on Talia.
"Ridiculous! And old news as well," she replied to the most recent sally. "Besides, there's somebody here who's managed to captivate a lad who's a lot harder to catch than Bairn is."
A chorus of Who? Greeted the revelation.
What?
Nerissa's eyes glinted with mischief.
You mean none of you noticed anything? Bright Havens, you must be denser than I thought. I would have figured that someone else would have seen that our Skiff's attentions to Talia are a great deal warmer than brotherly of late. Oh, really?
Sherry turned to look at Talia, who was blushing hotly.
I thought you were my friend, Talia. You might have told me.
Talia blushed even redder and stammered out a disclaimer.
Oh, my, Sherry teased. So vehement. Sounds to me a little too vehement.
After a while, Talia managed to stop blushing and to give as good as she got. From then on, her relationships with her fellow students were a great deal easier. Meals were another time when she could forget the problems with getting closer to Elspeth. There had always been a certain amount of pranking about in the kitchen. Miro saw to it that their hands were always too full for them to get into mischief, but he put no such rein on their mouths. Miro himself was a favored target, and Talia, with her innocent face, was now the one generally picked to try and fool him.
Haven't you forgotten something, Miro?
I? Talia, you are surely mistaken.
I don't know, Miro, one of the others chimed in. It seems to me that the salt cellar is missing.
By the book, it is. What could I have done with the cursed thing?
He searched for it with feigned panic, watching out of the corner of his eye while they passed it from hand to hand, grinning hugely. At last, Talia got it back again and placed it prominently on the table while his back was turned.
Ha!
He shouted, pouncing on it.
Now I know I looked there before.
He stared directly at Talia, who shrugged guilelessly.
Kobolds,
he muttered while they smothered giggles.
There must be kobolds in my kitchen. What's this place coming to?
5 minutes later, he got his revenge.
Would you say, young Talia, that you are a fairly good hand in the kitchen?
He asked, as the hoist went up with the precious salt cellar on it.
I guess so.
And would you say that you know how to prepare just about any common dish of your Holt people?
He persisted.
Definitely,
she replied injudiciously.
Ah, good. Then certainly you can show me what to do with this.
He dropped an enormous, gnarled, and knobbly root in front of her. Talia, who had never seen anything like it in her life, coughed and tried to temporize, while Miro's grin got wider and the rest of the kitchen helpers giggled. Finally, since it was evident that he wasn't going to feed them unless she admitted her ignorance or told him how to prepare it, she confessed to being defeated. Miro chuckled hugely and took the thing away, replacing it with their lunch.
What is it, anyway? Griffin asked.
A briar barrel, Miro laughed. I doubt Talia could have done anything with it that would have pleased the human palate, but she might have managed a gourmet meal for a termite ant.
Meals themselves were high points of the day. She had a permanent seat now at the second table, sandwiched between Cheryl and Jerry, across from Skiff, Griffin, and Karen. To the eternal amusement of the girls and their teacher, both Griffin and Skiff insisted on cosseting her, Griffin with the air of a big brother, Skiff's intentions obviously otherwise, although he attempted to counterfeit Griffin's. Griffin wasn't fooled by Skiff in the least.
Watch yourself, you,
he growled under his breath.
You treat my Talia right, or I'll feed you to the river with your best clothes on.
Cheryl and the others overheard this subtle threat, and their faces puckered with the effort not to laugh. Skiff retaliated by picking Griffin's pockets bare even of lint, without the larger boy even being aware of the fact.
More greens, brother?
He asked innocently, passing Griffin a plate containing his possessions. Talia had to be saved from choking to death as she attempted to keep from giggling at the dumbfounded look on Griffin's face. That night, Talia was on the receiving end of unmerciful teasing when they all got their baths at the end of the day.
Oh, Talia!
Jerry piled her head on the top of her head and simpered at her in imitation of Skiff.
Would you like a mushroom? Take 2, take 100. Oh, thank you, no, dear, Skiff,
Cheryl batted her eyelashes coyly at Skiff.
"I'd much rather have a pickle."
"I'll just bet you would, wouldn't you?"
Skiff replied with a leer. About this time, the real Talia was torn between hilarity and outraged embarrassment.
"I don't know where you got your filthy minds,"
she said, attacking both of them with a bar of soap and a sponge,
"but they plainly need a good scrubbing."
The episode degenerated at that point into a ducking and splashing match that soaked every towel in the room and brought down the wrath of the housekeeper on all three of them.
"Hist!"
Someone hissed at Talia from behind the bushes next to the entrance to the gardens. She jumped, remembering all too well the misery of the months previous, then relaxed as she realized the whisperer was Skiff.
"What on earth are you doing in there?"
she asked, getting down on hands and knees and seeing him in a kind of tunnel between two planted rows of hedges.
"What I told you I'd do, spying on the brat. There's something I want to show you. Squeeze on in here and follow me."
She looked at him a bit doubtfully, then saw that he was completely serious and did as he asked. They crawled through the prickly tunnel for some time before Skiff stopped and Talia all but bumped into him. He signed at her to be quiet and parted the twigs on one side, just enough for both of them to peer through. Elspeth and her two nurses, Hulda and Melody, were no more than a few feet away. They had no problem listening in on their conversation.
"Oh, now, dear," Hulda was saying gently, "it's quite out of the question. Your rank is much too high for you to be associating with Lord Delphor's children. You are the heir to the throne, after all."
Talia bit her lip angrily as Elspeth's face fell. Old Melody seemed to wake up a little from her half-doze. Her wrinkled face was creased with a faint frown as she seemed to be struggling to remember something.
"Hulda,
she began slowly.
that just doesn't seem right somehow."
"What doesn't seem right, dear?"
Hulda asked with artificial sweetness.
"Elspeth isn't... she... can't...
be expected to know these things. I know. Now don't you worry about a thing. Just drink your medicine like a dear, love, and I'll take care of everything."
Hulda poured a tiny glass of something red and sticky-looking and all but forced it into Melody's hand. The old woman gave up the struggle for thought and obediently drank it down. Not long afterward, she fell asleep again. Skiff motioned that they should leave, and they backed out of the hedgerow on all fours.
"That's what I wanted you to see,"
he said, as they exited the hedge in a distant part of the garden.
"Hold still. You've got twigs in your hair."
He began picking them out carefully.
"So have you, and leaves. She must be drugging Melody, and keeping her drugged. Witch. But how did the old woman get into a state where she allowed herself to be drugged in the first place?"
"You've got me. I can't hazard a guess. Ask Jadis, maybe he knows. Want me to keep watching?"
"If you don't mind. I want to know if she's doing this on her own or at someone else's direction, and I want to know what else she's telling the child."
"Oh, I don't mind. This is fun. It's like being back on the streets again, except that now I'm not in danger of losing a hand or being hungry all the time."
He grinned.
"Oh, Skiff."
She stopped, unsure of what to say next. Then, greatly daring, she leaned forward on an impulse and kissed his cheek lightly, blushed, and scampered away. Skiff stared after her in surprise, one hand raised to touch the spot she'd kissed. Jadis didn't know anything about the state of Melody's health, but he directed her to one of the healers who would.
"Melody was ill about 2 years ago," she said thoughtfully. "Do you know what a brainstorm is? Isn't that where an old person suddenly can't move or talk, maybe even falls unconscious for a long time and then gets better, slowly?"
The healer nodded.
"That's what happened to Melody. She seemed to have recovered completely, at least to me. I might have been wrong, though. Lady knows we aren't infallible." "Maybe you weren't wrong. Or maybe she was affected in some way that you wouldn't have noticed, Talia replied, sounding much more adult than she appeared and making the healer's eyes widen in surprise. Keldar's mother had a brainstorm after she brought her to live at our hold. She seemed completely all right, except that you had to be very careful what you said to her, because she'd believe anything you told her, no matter how absurd it was. That might have been what happened to Melody. And if it was, she thought grimly, she'd have been easy prey for Hulda. As for that medicine you saw Hulda giving her, I never prescribed anything like that for her, but it might be a folk remedy, or one of the other healers might have ordered it for her. I can check if you'd like. Talia belatedly realized that this might not be a wise idea. She didn't want Hulda alerted if the woman was up to something, and she didn't want her embarrassed if she wasn't. No, that's all right, thank you. It probably is just a folk remedy. In fact, now that I think of it, it looked a lot like a syrup Keldar used to give our mother for aching joints. The healer smiled with obvious relief. Melody does have arthritis, and unfortunately there isn't much we can do for her other than try and ease the pain. The potion might very well be one of ours. I'm glad the other nurse seems to be taking care of her then. Is there anything else I can do for you? No, thank you, Talia replied. You've answered everything I needed to ask. But, she thought, as she walked slowly back to her room, you raised a lot more questions than you answered. Chapter 9. If only I could go back in time.
If only you could what?
Skiff asked, looking up from the book he'd been studying. Talia was perched in his open window, staring out at the moonlit trees, her own mind plainly not on study. I said, if only I could go back in time, she repeated. I'd give half an arm to know if there was anyone besides Elspeth's father involved in bringing Hulda here, especially since she arrived after he was dead. But the only way I could find that out is to go back in time.
Not quite.
Skiff's expression was speculative, and Talia waited for him to finish the thought.
There's the immigration records. Everything about anyone who comes in from out kingdom is in them. If Hulda had any other sponsors, they'd be in there. And it seems to me there's something in the laws about immigrants having to have 3 sponsors to live here permanently. One would have been the prince, and one Selenai, but the third might prove very interesting.
Where are these records kept? Can anybody get at them? Talia's voice was full of eagerness.
They're kept right here at the palace, in the provost marshal's office. Keeping those records is one of his duties, but as for getting at them...
Skiff made a face.
We can't, not openly. Well, you could, but you'd have to invoke authority as Queen's own, and Hulda would be sure to hear of it.
Not a good idea, Talia agreed. So we can't get at them openly, but...
But I could get at them. It's no big deal, just
that the book is there too, Talia finished for him. Well, you haven't had any misdemeanors down in the book for nearly a year, have you?
Hell no, you've been keeping me too busy.
He grinned. Then the grin faded.
Still, if I got caught, they'd figure I was in there to alter the book. Orthalin doesn't like me at all. I'm like a burr under his saddle. I don't grant him proper respect. I don't act like a sober, heraldic trainee. He'd love the chance to really slap me down.
He looked at Talia's troubled face. Then his grin revived.
Oh, hell, what can he do to me anyway? Confine me to the collegium grounds? I haven't been off 'em since I met you, almost. I'll do it, by the gods.
There was something wrong. There was something very wrong. Skiff wasn't late, not yet, but Talia suddenly had the feeling that he was in a lot of trouble, and more than he could handle. And tonight was the night he was supposed to be getting into those immigration records. Although she had no clear idea of what she was going to do, Talia found herself running through the halls of the collegium, then the halls of the palace itself. It was only when she neared Selenay's quarters that she paused her headlong flight, waited until she had her breath back, and then approached the door of the Queen's private chambers shyly.
The guard there knew her well. He winked at her and entered through the door to announce her. She could hear the vague murmur of voices. Then he opened the door again and waved her inside. She drew in a trembling breath and prayed that something would guide her, and went in. The door closed quietly behind her. Selene was sitting at the work table, flushed and disturbed-looking. Elkarth, Karen, and the Seneschal's Herald Kirill were standing like a screen between Talia and something behind them. Standing between Selene and the Heralds was Lord Orthalin. Talia's heart sank. It was Skiff, then. She had to save him. He'd been caught, and it must have been much worse than he thought, but how was she going to be able to get him off?
Majesty,
she heard herself saying,
I've got something to confess.
Selene looked confused, and Talia continued,
I asked Skiff to do something for me. It wasn't quite legal.
As Selene waited, Talia continued in a rush,
I wanted him to get the Holderkin records for me.
The Holderkin records, Selene repeated, puzzled. But why? Talia had no notion where these ideas were coming from, but apparently they were good ones. She hated the notion of lying, but she daren't tell the truth either.
I wanted to make sure I wasn't in them anymore.
To her own surprise, she felt hot, angry tears starting to make her eyes smart.
They didn't want me. Well, I don't want them. Not any of them, not ever. Skiff told me Sense Holding could claim privilege tax when I earn my weights, and I don't want them to have it.
Now she was really crying with anger, flushed and believing every word she'd told them herself. Selene was smiling a smile bright with relief. Elkarth looked bemused, Karen vindicated, Kirill slightly amused, and Orthalin. Talia was startled by his expression. Orthalin looked for one brief instant like a man who has been cheated out of something he thought surely in his grasp. Then he resumed his normal expression, a cool, impassive mask, and try as she might, Talia couldn't get past it.
You see, Orthalin, I told you there'd be a simple explanation,
Elkarth was saying then, as the heralds moved apart, and Talia could see who it was they had been screening from her view. She wasn't surprised to see Skiff, white and tense, sitting in a chair as if he'd been glued there.
Then why wouldn't the boy tell us himself?
Orthalin asked coldly.
Because I didn't want Talia in trouble too, Skiff said in a surly tone of voice. I told you I wasn't after the book, so what business was it of yours what I did want? You aren't the Provost Marshal.
Skiff, Kirill said mildly, he may not be the Provost Marshal, but Lord Orthalin is entitled to a certain amount of respect from you.
Yes, sir,
Skiff mumbled and looked steadfastly at his feet.
Well, now that this matter seems to have cleared itself up, shall we let the miscreants go?
Selene smiled slightly.
Talia, the next time you want something in the records, just ask Kirill or myself, and we'll make sure you aren't listed in the census as Holderkin anymore, if that's what you want. But, well, I still don't quite understand why you didn't come to me in the first place.
Talia knew from the tightness of the skin of her face that she had gone from red to white.
It was selfish, unherald-like. I didn't want anybody else to know.
Elkarth had crossed the space between them and placed an arm around her shoulders.
You're only human, little one, and your kin doesn't deserve any kindness from you after the way they've disowned you. Skiff?
He held out his hand to the boy, who stood slowly, and came to stand beside Talia, taking one of her hands and staring at Orthalin defiantly.
You and Talia, go back to your rooms, why don't you? You've had a long night. Don't do this again, younglings, but, well, we understand. Now, get along.
Skiff all but dragged Talia from the room.
Good gods! How the hell did you think of that? You were great! I started to believe you. And how did you know I was up to my ears in trouble?
I don't know. It just sort of came, Talia replied, and I just knew you were in for it. What happened? How did you get caught?
Sheer bad luck,
Skiff said ruefully, slowing their headlong rush down the hall.
Selenay needed some of the census reports, and Ortholin came after them. He saw my light in the Provost Marshal's office and caught me red-handed. Good gods, was I stupid? It wouldn't have happened if I'd been paying any attention at all to the sounds from the corridor.
What was he going to do to you?
He was trying to get me suspended. He couldn't get me expelled unless Simri repudiated me, but, well, he was trying to get me sent off to clean stables for the army for the next 4 years, until I learned what honest work means, he said.
Could he have done that?
Unfortunately, he could. I've got one too many marks in the book. There's an obscure collegium rule covering that, and he found out about it somehow. If I didn't know better, I'd say he's been looking for a way to get me.
You'd better stop helping me, then. By now they were outside Talia's door.
Be damned if I will. This is so frustrating. I just found Hulda's records, too. Well, we'll just have to give up on those and stick with what we've been doing. But there's no way I'm going to let this stop me.
He stopped and gave her a quick hug, then pushed her toward her door.
Go on, get some sleep. You look like you could use it, and I feel like somebody's been using me for pels.
Talia was studying alone in her room one night when there was a light tapping on her door. She opened it to find a black, demonic-looking creature on the other side. A hand clamped over her mouth before she could shriek, and the thing dragged her back inside, kicking the door closed behind it.
"Shh! Don't yell! It's me, Skiff!"
the thing admonished her in a hoarse whisper. He took his hand away from her mouth gingerly, ready to clamp it down again if she screamed. She didn't. Just stared at him with huge, round eyes.
"Skiff, what are you trying to do to me?" she said finally. "I nearly died of fright. Why are you rigged out like that? What do you think? You don't go climbing around in the restricted parts of the palace dressed in greys. And I'm a bit too young to look convincing in whites. Get your breath back and calm yourself down, because tonight you're coming with me." "Me? But don't argue, just get into these."
He handed her a tight-fitting shirt and breeches of dusty black.
"Good thing you're my size, nearly. And don't ask me where I got them, or why, because I can't tell you."
He waited patiently while she laced herself into the garments, then handed her a box of greasy black soot.
"Rub this anywhere there's skin showing, and don't miss anything, not even the back of your neck."
He went to her window, opened it to its widest extent, and looked down.
"Good. We won't even have to go down to the ground from here."
He produced a rope and tied it around Talia's waist.
"Now, follow me, and do exactly what I do."
The scramble that followed was something Talia preferred not to remember in later years. Skiff had them climbing from window to window across the entire length of the Collegium wing, and from there along the face of the palace itself. Talia was profoundly grateful for the narrow ledge that ran most of the way, for she doubted she could have managed without it. At length, he brought them to a halt just outside a darkened window. Talia clung with all her might to the wall, trying not to think of the drop behind her, as he peered cautiously in through the cracks in the shutter. He seemed satisfied with what he found, for he took something out of a pouch at his belt and began working away at the chink between the two halves of the shutter. Before too long, they swung open. Skiff climbed inside, and Talia followed him. The room disclosed was bare of furniture and seemingly unused. Skiff led her to the closet set into one wall, opened it, and felt along the back wall. Talia heard the scrape of wood on wood, and a pair of peepholes was revealed. Light shone through them from the other side. Talia quickly put her eye to one, and as she did so, Skiff handed her a common drinking glass. He pantomimed placing it to the wall and putting her ear against it. She did, and realized she could hear every word spoken in the other room, faintly, but clearly.
"So at this rate, the child is unlikely ever to be chosen, much less made heir. You're doing quite well indeed," an unctuous baritone said with satisfaction. "Needless to say, we're quite well pleased with you."
"My lord is most gracious."
Talia could see the second speaker, Hulda, but was unable to see the first, and his voice was too distorted by the glass for her to recognize it.
"Shall I continue as I have gone?"
"Has the child herald made any further attempts at Elspeth?"
"No, my lord. She seems to have become discouraged."
"Still," the first speaker paused and thought, "we cannot take the chance. I suggest you continue your practice of telling bedtime tales. You know the ones I mean."
"If my lord refers to those featuring companions who carry off unwary children to a terrible fate, my lord can rest assured that I will do so."
"Excellent. Here's another supply of the drug for the nurse and your usual stipend."
Talia heard the chink of coins in one of the 2 pouches Hulda accepted.
"You will come out of this a wealthy woman, Hulda," the first speaker said as footsteps marked his retreat.
"Oh, I intend it so, my lord," Hulda said, with venom to the closed door. Then she too turned and left the room by a second door.
Talia was too busy thinking about what she'd witnessed to worry about the return trip. When they reached her room, Talia seized a towel and began ruthlessly scrubbing the soot away.
"Is that the first time you've watched that?" she asked as she scrubbed.
"The third. The first time was by accident. I'd been following the witch and had to duck into that other room to hide from her. I found the cracks behind a patch in the closet. The second time, I took a guess that the first was a regular meeting. I was right. You know something else? No, that's too far-fetched."
"What is?"
"Well, a couple of times Melody started to refuse that drug the witch had been feeding her, and, well, she did something. I don't know what, but it made her drink it anyway. If I didn't know better, I'd have sworn she was using real magic. You know, old magic, like in the legends, to hold power over Melody's mind."
"She's probably got some touch of a gift."
Yeah, I guess you're right."
"Here, get into these. They're too big for me, so they might fit you."
Talia handed Skiff a set of clothing.
"Why?"
he asked, astonished.
"Because as soon as you're dressed, we're going to Jadis."
Jadis was asleep when they reached his room. Under ordinary circumstances, Talia would never have dared disturb him, but she felt the occasion warranted her waking him. Skiff opened his door silently, and both of them slipped inside. He roused before Talia and Skiff could reach his side, staring at them with a dagger suddenly in his hand. The elderly Herald had been sleeping uneasily for several nights running, and had taken to sleeping as he had in his younger days, with a knife beneath his pillow. He woke with wary immediacy, and sat up with the knife in one hand before they were halfway across his bedroom. He blinked in surprise to see the 2 soot-streaked trainees frozen in mid-step.
"Talia!"
He was shocked at her presence. Skiff, with his penchant for pranks, he might have expected.
"Why?"
"Please, sir, I'm sorry, but it's an emergency."
Jadis shook the last sleep from his head, sat up and gathered a blanket around his shoulders.
"Very well, then. I know you better than to think you'd be exaggerating. Blow up the fire, light some candles, and tell me about it."
He heard them out, Talia prompting Skiff to tell his part. Before they'd told him more than a quarter of their tale, he knew that it definitely warranted the classification of emergency. By the time they'd finished it, he was chilled.
"If I didn't know you both, I'd have sworn you were making up tales," he said finally. "And I almost wish you were."
"Sir?"
Talia asked after a lengthy silence, her face drawn with exhaustion.
"What should I do?"
"You, youngling, nothing."
He reached out to both of them, gathering one in each arm and hugging them, grateful for their intelligence and courage.
"Talia, Skiff, both of you have done far more than any of your elders have managed. I'm pleased and proud of both of you. But now you'll have to trust me to take care of the rest. There are those who need to be told who will listen to an adult, but not to the same words from the mouth of a child. I hope you'll let me speak for you."
Skiff sighed explosively.
"Let you? Holy stars! I was afraid you were going to make me tell all this to Kirill or Selene myself, and after getting caught going after those records, I'm afraid my credit isn't any too high with them right now. Oh no, Herald, I'd much rather that I was not the bearer of the bad news. If you don't mind, I'd rather go find my bath and my bed. And you, Talia?
Please, if you would. She looked up at him with eyes full of exhaustion and entreaty. I wouldn't know what to say. There's too many questions we can't answer. We don't know who my lord is, for one thing, and if Lord Orthalin starts shouting at me, I think I might cry.
Then go, both of you. You can leave everything to me.
The two rose and padded out, and he sat in deep thought for a moment before ringing for his servant.
Medrin, I need you to have Selene wakened. Ask her to come to my room and tell her that it's quite urgent that she do so. Then do the same for the Seneschal, Herald Kirill, and Herald Elkarth. Build the fire up and bring wine and food.
He stared thoughtfully into the distance for a moment.
I have the feeling that it is going to be a very long night.
Talia heard no more about Hulda the next day, nor in fact did she really care to. She was content to leave the matter in the hands of the adults. The sweet smell of spring blossoms tempted her out into the garden that evening at dusk. Since the banishment of the troublemakers, there was no danger in roaming the grounds at any hour any more. She was breathing in the heady scent of hyacinth flowers when she heard strangled sobs emanating from one of the garden grottos that were so popular with couples after dark. At first, Talia thought that it must be a jilted lover or some other poor unfortunate of the same ilk that was weeping, but the sobs sounded childlike as they increased in strength. She began to feel the same compulsion to investigate them that had prompted her to the Queen's side the winter before. She remembered what she'd been told about trusting her instincts and acted on the impulse. She approached the grotto as noiselessly as she could and peered inside. Lying face down on the moss, weeping as if her heart were broken, was the heir. She entered and sat down beside the child. "You don't look much like a fish anymore," she said lightly, but putting as much sympathy as she could muster into her words. "You look more like a waterfall. What's wrong?"
They sent Hulda away.
The child wept. "Who are they, and why did they send her away?" Talia asked, not yet knowing the results of Jadis's conference.
My mother and that nasty Kirill, and I don't know why. She was my only friend, and nobody else likes me.
"I'm sorry for you. It's awful to be lonely and alone. I know. When I was your age, they sent my best friend away to be married to a ghastly old man, and I never saw her again." The tears stopped.
"Did you cry?"
the child asked with artless interest. "I did when I was alone, but I didn't dare around other people. My elders told me that it was sinful to cry over something so unimportant. I think that was very wrong of them, because sometimes crying can make you feel better. Are you feeling a little better now?"
"Some,"
the child admitted.
"What's your name?"
"Talia."
"What's yours?"
The girl's chin lifted arrogantly.
"You should call me Highness."
"Not yet, I shouldn't. You're not really the heir until you have a companion and prove you can be a herald first."
"I'm not, but that's not what Hulda said."
"It's true, though. Ask anybody. Perhaps she didn't know, or perhaps she lied to you."
"Why would she lie to me?"
The child was bewildered. "Well, I can think of at least one reason. Because she didn't want you to make friends with other children, so that she could be the only friend you had. So she made you think that you were more important than you are, and you've made other people so annoyed with you that they've left you all alone."
"How do I know that you aren't lying?"
the girl asked belligerently. "I'm a herald, or I will be in a few years,
and heralds aren't allowed to lie."
The child digested this and looked as if she found it very unpalatable indeed.
"She probably lied to me all the time then. She probably even lied to me about being my friend."
Her lip quivered, and it looked as if the weeping was about to break out anew.
"Then that means I don't have any friends."
The threatened tears came, and Talia instinctively gathered the unresisting child to her. She stroked her soothingly while she cried herself to exhaustion again and produced a handkerchief to dry the sore eyes and nose when the weeping bout was over.
"You haven't any friends now, but that doesn't mean that you can't make friends," Talia told her. "I'll be your friend, if you'd like, but you have to make me one promise." "Tell me what I have to promise first," the child said with a hint of suspicion, which told Talia more about Nurse Hulda's treatment of the girl than 1,000 reports could have. "The promise is very simple, but it's going to be awfully hard to keep. I'm not sure you'll be able to." Talia allowed doubt to creep into her voice. "I can do it! I know I can! Just tell me!" "It's in 2 parts. The first part is, no matter what I say to you, you won't get mad at me until you've gone away and thought about what I said. The second part is, you still won't get mad at me unless what I said wasn't true. And you can prove it." "I promise! I promise!" she said recklessly. "Since you're my friend now, won't you tell me your name?" The child flushed with embarrassment. "Promise you won't laugh." "I promise, but I wouldn't laugh anyway." "Hulda laughed. She said it was a stupid name." The child stared at her lap. "It's Elspeth." "There was no reason for Hulda to laugh. You have a very nice name. It's nicer than Talia." "Hulda said only peasants are named Elspeth."
Talia had a suspicion that she was going to grow very weary of the words Hulda said before too long. "That's not true. I know that for sure. There were 3 queens of this kingdom named Elspeth. Elspeth the peacemaker, Elspeth the wise, and Elspeth clever-handed. You'll have a hard time living up to the name of Elspeth, especially if you want to become the kind of person that could win a companion and be the heir." Elspeth looked frightened and worried.
I don't know how," she said in small voice. "And companions, I'm afraid of them. Can you help me, please?"
The last was spoken in a whisper.
"Well, first you could start by treating people nicer than you do now. And I mean everybody, highborn or low. If you do that, you'll start having more friends, too, and they'll be real friends who like being with you, not people who only act friendly because they think you can get them something." "I treat people nicely," Elspeth objected. "Oh, really?"
Talia screwed her face into an ugly scowl and proceeded to do an imitation of the brat at her worst.
"If that's treating people nicely, I'd hate to have you mad at me. Do you really think that anyone would want to be a friend of someone like that?" "No," Elspeth said in a shamed voice. "If you want to change, you have to start by thinking about everything you say or do before you say or do it. Think about how you'd feel if someone acted like that to you."
Talia reached out impulsively and hugged the forlorn child.
"I can see that there's a very nice person named Elspeth sitting here, but there's an awful lot of people who can't see past the brat. That's what they call you, you know." "Can't my mother make me the heir? Hulda said she could."
"The law is that the heir must also be a herald, and not even the queen is above the law. If you're not careful, Jerry may get the title. She's got blood as good as yours, and she's already been chosen." The vulnerable child that looked out of Elspeth's eyes won Talia's heart completely.
"You really will help me?"
"I already promised I would.
I'm your friend, remember? That's what friends are for, to help each other.
Lord of Lights, what have I gotten myself in for? Talia frequently asked herself throughout the next few weeks. She found herself running from classes or chores to the royal nursery and back again on at least a thrice-daily basis. She had breakfast with Elspeth now, rather than with the collegium. After supper, which was served at the collegium at a much earlier hour than at court, she would return. Then, in the evening after supper, she would spend the time until Elspeth returned to her rooms with Jadis. When Elspeth got back, they would walk in the gardens before the child's bedtime. Hulda had vanished from her rooms before Selene could have her taken into custody for questioning. Someone, presumably someone on the council, had warned her in time for her to flee. Talia had little time to spare to wonder what had happened to the woman. She was too busy trying to unmake the brat. It was an uphill battle all the way. Elspeth pulled temper tantrums over the smallest of things. Her milk was too cold, her bath was too hot, her pillow was too soft, she didn't like the color of the clothing chosen for her. Talia put up with the first two of these displays of temper, hoping if she ignored them Elspeth would stop. Unfortunately, this trick didn't work. The third of Elspeth's tantrums brought Talia's first attempt at correcting her. It began when one of her maids pulled her hair while brushing it out. The child grabbed the brush and slapped the woman with it without thinking. Talia took the brush away and handed it to the startled maid. "Hit her back," she ordered. But miss, I can't," the maid stuttered. "I'll take the responsibility. Hit her back, as hard as she hit you." To Elspeth's open amazement, the maid gave her a sturdy smack on the rear with the offending brush. Elspeth opened her mouth to shriek, indulging in a full-scale fit, the kind that had always cowed others into doing things her way before. Talia calmly picked up a glass of water and threw it in her face. "Now," Talia said as the child sputtered, "these are the new rules around here. Anything you do to someone else, you'll get right back. If you can't learn to think before you act, you'll have to take what's coming to you. She didn't pull your hair on purpose, after all." She turned to the maid. "I'm sure you have other things to do than wait on an unruly little beast." The maid recognized a dismissal when she heard one. Her eyes gleamed with amusement. She could hardly wait to spread the word about the new ordering of things. "Yes, my lady," she said, and vanished. "Now, since you can't be trusted not to abuse the privilege of having a servant do it, you'll just have to brush your own hair, and tend to everything else as well." Talia handed the brush back to Elspeth, who gaped in astonishment as she left. So, Elspeth struggled along without the aid of servants. She looked like a rag bag, and knew it, and hated it. The servants, on the Queen's orders, were not bothering to conceal their own enjoyment of the new state of things, nor were they backward in making it obvious that they thought Elspeth was only getting what was due her. The courtiers were worse. They smiled and acted as if nothing were wrong, but Elspeth could tell that they were inwardly laughing at her. Talia continued to spend time with her and would help her with hair or clothing, but only if she asked politely. It was an altogether unexpected and unsatisfactory state of affairs. Elspeth's reaction was to prove she didn't care, by wrecking her nursery. She spent one very satisfying morning overturning furniture, tearing the bedclothes off the bed and heaping them in the middle of the room, breaking toys and flinging the bits about. She was sitting in the middle of the wreckage, slightly out of breath and quite satisfied, when Talia arrived. Talia surveyed the ruins with a calm eye. "Well," she said, "I suppose you realize the nursery is going to stay this way until you clean it up." Elspeth gaped at her. She'd expected Talia to be angry. Then the implications began to dawn on her. But, where am I going to sleep?" "Either in the middle of the floor, or on the bare mattress, it's up to you. Either one is a better bed than Skiff ever had in the street, or I had on sheep watch. For that matter, it's a better bed than I get now when I've got full watch." Elspeth began to cry. Talia watched her impassively. When the tears didn't bring capitulation, Elspeth picked up a wooden block and threw it angrily at Talia's head.
That brought a response all right, but it wasn't the one Elspeth wanted. Talia dodged the missile with ease and advanced on the child with compressed lips. Before Elspeth realized what was happening, Talia had picked her up and administered 3 good stinging swats to the girl's rear, then set her down again. "Next time," Talia warned, before the real howls of outrage could begin and drown her out, "it'll be 6 swats." Then she left the room. Although unknown to Elspeth, she stayed close by the door and shut the door behind her. Elspeth cried herself nearly sick, missed dinner, and fell asleep in the tangle of blankets in the middle of the room. Talia knew very well that one missed meal was hardly going to hurt the child, but made a point of appearing the next day with a very hearty breakfast on a tray, acting as if nothing was wrong. She helped the much subdued youngster to bathe and dress, and got her hair untangled for the first time in 3 days. All was well until lunch, when Elspeth demanded to know when someone was going to clean up her room. "It will get cleaned when you do it, not before," was Talia's adamant reply. This elicited another tantrum, another hurled toy, and the promised 6 swats. And Talia left for afternoon classes with Elspeth still crying in a corner. After 3 days of this, Talia arrived at the nursery after dinner to find Elspeth struggling to untangle the heavy blankets. She had already gotten what furniture she could lift back in the upright position, and more or less back in place. Wordlessly, Talia helped her with the rest, gathered the broken toys with her, and put them back on the shelves. That night, Elspeth slept in her bed for the first time in a week, falling asleep with Talia holding her hand and singing to her. The next battles were over the broken toys. When the toys she'd smashed weren't magically replaced as they'd always been in the past, Elspeth wanted to know why. "You obviously didn't care about them, so you won't get any more," Talia told her. "If you want toys to play with, you'll have to fix the broken ones yourself." This occasioned a near repeat of the previous week, though this time Elspeth had more sense than to throw anything at Talia. She cried herself sick again, though, and by the end of the 5th day, Talia was heartily tired of this tactic. She figured it was about time to put a stop to it, so she picked the girl up, dumped her in the tub in her bathing room, and doused her with cold water. "You were making yourself sick," she said as gently as she could while Elspeth sputtered. "Since you wouldn't stop, I figured I'd better stop you." Elspeth took care never to cry herself sick again, though this time she held out for a full 2 weeks more. At the end of that time, Talia found her with a glue brush in one hand and a broken wagon in the other. She had bits of paper sticking to her hair and face and arms and glue all over her and was wearing a totally pathetic expression. One slow, genuine tear crept down her cheek as she looked up at Talia. I don't know how to fix it," she said quietly. "I tried. I really, really tried, but it just stays broken." Talia took the toy and the brush from her hands and hugged and kissed her, oblivious to the glue. "Then I'll help you. All you ever had to do was ask." It took the better part of a month to fix all the broken toys, and some were smashed beyond redemption. Talia did not offer to have these replaced. Elspeth had a tantrum or 2 over this, but compared to her earlier performances, they were half-hearted at worst. She was beginning to get the notion that Talia was a much better companion when Elspeth wasn't making fur fly. Then Talia judged that it was about time for the girl's schooling to start. After the first day of screaming fits, only screaming, no attacks and no destruction, Elspeth had learned that much at least. Talia arranged to miss a week of her own morning classes. By the end of that week, she felt as if she'd been breaking horses, but Elspeth had bowed beneath the yoke of learning and was even grudgingly beginning to like it. Gradually, Elspeth's good days began to outnumber her bad ones. As they did so, more and more amenities came back into her life. Her servants returned. She treated them like glass, apparently afraid they'd vanish again if she so much as raised her voice. First, the toys that had been totally destroyed were replaced, one by one and without a word being said, then the ones that had been broken and inexpertly mended, all except for one doll, one that had been torn limb from limb and which Talia had repaired. When Elspeth saw that the broken toys were being replaced, she took to keeping that one with her and sleeping with it at night. Talia smiled to herself, touched, and the doll remained. Progress was being made. Now there was a second problem to deal with. The child really had a horror of companions. She had nightmares about them and couldn't be persuaded to go anywhere near the field. Talia began trying to undo the effects of Hulda's horror stories with collegium gossip, which included as many tales about companions as about the trainees. As soon as she thought it feasible, she started taking Elspeth on walks before bedtime, and those walks took them closer and closer to Companion's Field. Finally, she took Elspeth right inside, having Rolan follow at a discreet distance. As days passed and the child became accustomed to his presence, Talia had him move in closer. Then came the triumphant day when she placed Elspeth on his back. The quick ride they shared cured the child of the last of her nightmares and hysterics and gave Talia a handy reward to offer for good behavior, for Elspeth had become as infatuated with companions as she had been terrified before. There were wonderful days after that, days when Elspeth was sweet and even-tempered, when being around her was a pleasure. And then there were the occasional miserable days, when she backslid into the brat again. On the bad days she had temper tantrums, insulted the servants, though she never again laid a hand on one, called Talia names, and wrecked her nursery just for the sheer pleasure of destroying things. Talia would bear with this up to a point, then give her 3 warnings. If the third wasn't heeded, the royal brat got a royal spanking and was left to her own devices for a time until she sought Talia out herself to apologize. Gradually, the good days came to outnumber the bad by a marked percentage, and it soon became possible to get the child to toe the line simply by reminding her of the fact that she was approaching bratly behavior. Talia was exhausted, but feeling well rewarded. As a concession to the incredible amounts of time she was putting in with the girl, she was first excused from her chores for a time, then from full watch duty. As the brat became more and more Elspeth, she began to take those tasks up again. As Elspeth became more interested in companions and less afraid of them, she became enthralled with the notion of full watch, which in summer was a far from onerous duty, though it could be, and often was, pure misery in the winter. Companion mares did not foal with the ease of horses. Those who had chosen, of course, had their heralds or trainees to stay by them when the time came, but those who had not chosen had no one. If there were complications, minutes could often mean the life of mare or foal. Karen did what she could, of course, but she couldn't be everywhere, and she needed a certain amount of sleep herself. So one of the duties of the trainees was to spend the nights when an unpartnered companion mare was nearly ready to foal constantly by her side. Talia had one such stint just after midsummer, and Elspeth begged so hard to share it with her that Talia relented and gave in. She hadn't expected anything to come of it, nor from what she could pick up from Rolan was the mare herself expecting to drop for at least a week. But much to everyone's surprise, just before midnight, the mare awakened Talia and her charge with urgent nudges, labor well underway. It was Elspeth who ran to fetch Karen when it was evident to Talia's experienced eye that the foal was breech. Elspeth petted the mare's head and cooed to her, the creature a few months ago from which she would have fled in terror, while Karen and Talia got the foal turned. And it was Elspeth who helped the shaking little colt to his feet afterward and helped rub him down with coarse toweling. The mare imparted a message to Karen as the little one first began to suckle. Karen grinned and carefully pulled a few hairs from her tail, and a sleepy but overjoyed Elspeth was presented with a ring and bracelet braided on the spot as a thank-you present from his mum. She put them on immediately and refused to take them off, and thereafter, when Talia was sometimes expecting a temperamental outburst, she would often see the child stroke the bracelet, gulp hard, and exert control over herself. That night, signaled the real turning point. At last, well past midsummer, Elspeth approached her mother and asked permission so politely that Selene's mouth fell open to watch Talia at her afternoon classes. "Have you asked Talia if she minds an audience?" the Queen asked her transformed offspring.
"Yes, Lady Mother. She said it was all right to come to the morning ones too, but I've got different lessons from her then, so I didn't think that would be a very good idea. I'm supposed to be watching the fighters training in the afternoon, though, and riding, so that's the same if I'm doing it with the collegium students, isn't it? And I'm tired of doing it alone. Please?"
The Queen gave her permission, and turned to Talia, who had accompanied Elspeth but had not spoken during the interview, as the child left the room. "I can't believe my eyes and ears!" she exclaimed. "Is that the same child who terrorized her servants this winter? You've worked miracles."
"Elspeth's worked miracles,"
Talia corrected.
"I just had to give her reasons to change. I think we're all fortunate that this Hulda creature only had a really free hand with her for less than 2 years. If she'd had Elspeth at any earlier age, I don't think there would have been much anyone could have done to change her back."
"Then I thank all the gods that you discovered it was Hulda that was behind the change. All I knew for certain was that Elspeth gradually began to become a problem. I couldn't even take her on rides with me anymore. She had hysterics when Cario came near, hysterics only Hulda could calm."
Selene said thoughtfully,
"I can't believe how clever Hulda was about all this. The worst we thought she was doing was giving the child some inflated notions of her own importance. She claimed it was only a phase Elspeth was going through, and I was having some problems of my own in dealing with her. She was growing to look more and more like her father every day, and it was sometimes very hard for me to deal with her because of that. I could never be sure if I was making a rational judgment about her behavior, or one based on dislike of the man she resembled. Talia proposed fostering her. It's common enough to cause no comment. Poor old man, he simply didn't feel that he was capable of handling so young a child. Then, when we thought we had a solution, he was murdered."
Talia bit her lip. "So you know it for a fact now?"
"We found a vial of a rather strong heart medicine among the things she left behind. A little of it is beneficial, but too much, and the heart gives out in strain, exactly as Talamir's did. Poor Talimir. We always seemed to be stretching out to each other across a vast gulf of years, and never quite meeting. I know he did his very best for me, but he was too embarrassed by the situation to ever feel comfortable about being my confidant. And he was too much of a gentleman to give me a good set-down when I obviously needed it, not even verbally."
"Well, I certainly can't spank you,"
Talia retorted, with a touch of exasperation at the self-pitying mood the Queen had fallen into.
"Oh, no," Selene laughed. "That sounded like a well-placed verbal spank to me."
Talia reddened.
I apologize. I have no right to speak to you like that."
"Quite the contrary. You have every right to do so. The same right that Talimir had and didn't exercise."
Selene regarded the girl, with her head cocked slightly to one side.
"You know,
the tales all claim that the wisdom of the Queen's own knows no age barrier, and I'm beginning to believe the tales don't say everything. You're just as much my herald as if you had twice your years, as well as being Elspeth's. And believe me, little one, I intend never to have to do without you." Chapter 10. Several days later, the same topics came up again in conversation between Talia and the Queen.
"Bad enough that Hulda vanished,"
Selene said, more than annoyed, angered, in fact, at herself for letting the woman escape almost literally out of her own hand.
"I meant to have someone question her under the truth spell about my lord, even though I don't think she would have been able to tell us much. But Kirill has discovered that the immigration records on her have vanished as well." "Great heavens! Then we may never learn who she was working with."
"According to Skiff, The man she spoke with was always hooded and masked, and he doubts she even knew who he was. Talia was troubled, more troubled than she was willing to admit. But is she likely to give us further problems?
I doubt it. What could she do, after all? Even Melody is recovering, as much as she can.
That's very good to hear, Talia sighed with relief. Then whatever that drug was, it isn't going to have any lasting effects?
The healers say not, and I can't tell you how grateful I am to hear that you seem to have cured Elspeth's fear of companions.
It's rather remarkable how it vanished when Hulda did, Talia remarked dryly. It didn't take more than a few visits to Rolan and the others to cure it. She adores them now.
I'd noticed, Selene replied with a wry twist of her mouth, especially after Elspeth suddenly decided she wanted to share my afternoon rides with Cario again. That gives me a thought. I know you're busy, more so than ever before, but could you spare me an hour or so a week?
Talia sighed. I'll make the time somehow. Why?
I'd like you to take Talamir's place at council.
Talia choked. What? No? Why?
Why not? You'll have to take it sooner or later. I'd like you to get used to the machinations going on, and I'd like the councillors to get used to seeing you there. You needn't say anything during the sessions at all, but you just might see something that I wouldn't. That would be useful to know.
What could I possibly see?
Perhaps nothing, but perhaps a great deal. Besides, this will give you a certain amount of protection. Having you at my council table will make it very clear that I will not ignore attempts to harm you just because you're not a real herald yet.
May I make a condition?
Certainly.
I'd like Elspeth with me. That way, she won't feel left out, and it will show her more clearly than anything I could tell her that the job of reigning is work.
I agree, and I would never have thought of that.
That's not true, Talia protested.
It is, and you know it. And since you're acting as Queen's Own, you might as well call me by my given name. I'm getting tired of being highnessed and majestied. To you, I am just Selene.
Yes, Madge, Selene,
Talia replied, returning the Queen's smile.
The next council meeting is just after the noon meal, 2 days from now. Till then?
Elspeth had arrived promptly for Talia's arms lesson with Albric, and thereafter never missed one. The child seemed to be fascinated by the different styles the arms master was training them in. The rest of the trainees, warned in advance that Elspeth would be watching, went about their normal activities with only a hint of stiltedness. After a few moments, they began pausing now and again for a nod or a friendly word with the child, attempting to act as if she were just another trainee. Before very long, they no longer had to act. It seemed natural to accept her as one of them. Elspeth was a silent observer for a week or two when Albric evidently decided he had an idea he wished to try. And in a fashion typical to Albric, he did so without telling Talia about it beforehand. When he'd finished with Talia, his eye lighted on Elspeth, seemingly by accident, though Talia was well aware that, where lessons were concerned, nothing Albric did was by accident.
"You child," he barked. "Come here."
Talia saw Elspeth's chin begin to tighten and her nose to tilt up, a sure sign that she was about to revert to her old behavior. She managed to catch the girl's eye and made what Elspeth had taken to calling the royal awful face. Elspeth giggled and fingered her bracelet. All haughtiness evaporated, and she obeyed Albric with commendable docility.
"Look, all of you,"
he said, giving a short practice blade to her.
"At this age, she has learned no bad habits, so there's nothing for her to unlearn. She has more flexibility than an acrobat, and she'll learn more quickly than any 3 of you put together. Name, child?"
Elspeth, sir.
He demonstrated one of the primary exercises for her.
"Can you do that?"
A tiny frown between her brows, Elspeth did her best to imitate his movements. He made some minor corrections, then ran her through the exercise several more times, the last at full speed.
"There, you see. This is what you're striving to imitate, the agile and receptive mind and body of the young child. And watch.
He suddenly attacked her in such a way that the natural counter for her to make was the exercise he'd just taught her. She performed so flawlessly that she drew impromptu applause from the other students.
At this stage, once learned, never forgotten. Try to emulate her.
At Albrich's command, they returned to sparring with one another. He beckoned to Talia.
You have charge of this one,
he asked, as though he had no idea of Elspeth's identity. Yes, sir, she replied respectfully.
I should like to include her in the lessons. This can be arranged.
Easily, sir. Would you like to learn weapons work instead of just watching Elspeth? Oh, yes, the child responded eagerly, her eyes shining. Only...
Yes,
Albrich prompted. You won't hit me too hard, please, sir. Not like you hit Griffin. Albrich laughed, something Talia hadn't seen him do very often.
I gauge my punishments by the thickness of my students' skulls, child. Griffin has a very thick skull.
Griffin, who was close enough to hear every word, grinned and winked at the girl.
I think, Albrich continued, that you have not so thick a skull, so I shall only beat you a little. Now, we might as well begin with what I just taught you.
Talia realized as she watched them that Albrich had helped to deliver the death blow to the brat. Now, there was only Elspeth. After that, though there were occasional brief lapses, the child was able to maintain her good behavior with very little effort. Throughout the hot days of that summer, she rapidly became the pet of the collegium, although she was never in any danger of being spoiled, as everyone remembered only too well what the brat had been like. Rather than simply watching things, she began volunteering to help. At archery practice, she brought water and arrows to replace those broken. At weapons practice, chalk and dry towels. She did her best to help groom companions and clean tack, and not just Rolan and his gear, but turning a hand to help anyone who happened to be there. When it was Talia's turn at chores during their afternoons, Elspeth even insisted on doing her share. Miro, the cook, soon began looking forward to having her in the kitchen, and always had a special treat for his helpers on the days that she and Talia shared the work. Elspeth even had a certain fascination for the mending chores, never having known before how it was that torn clothing came to be repaired. She was not very good at it, though, not having the patience for tedious work, and preferred to do something active, like sorting the clothing into piles of still good enough, wear only to work out, and hopeless, her own terms, quickly adopted by the rest. Hopeless was a particular favorite, the mender in question enacting mourning scenes over the offending garment. It got to be a regular game, one all of them enjoyed to the hilt. By the time the leaves were turning, no one could imagine the collegium without Elspeth running about with the trainees. One chilly afternoon, with the last desiccated leaves blowing against Talia's window, there was a quiet knock on her door. When Talia opened it, Cheryl was standing there, in whites. Talia was speechless for a moment, then hugged her friend as hard as she could, exclaiming breathlessly, "You did it! You did it!" Cheryl hugged back, one happy tear escaping from her eyes. "I guess I did," she said when Talia finally let her go. "You're the first to know, except for Elkoff." "I am! Oh, Sherry, I don't know what to say. It's wonderful. I'm so glad for you. When are you leaving on your assignment?" "Next week," she said, seeming to feel more than a little awkward suddenly. "And I had another reason for coming here, seeing as I'm sort of your mentor. Well, there's something I have to tell you about before I leave." "Go on," Talia replied, wondering why her friend was so ill at ease. "Well, what do you think of boys?" "I never really thought about it much," she replied. "I mean, do you like them? You seem to like Skiff a lot." "I'm not like Karen, if that's what you mean." "No, it isn't," Cheryl squirmed in frustration. "You know, about babies and all that, right?"
I should hope so, seeing as they'd planned on marrying me off before I came here, Talia replied with some amusement. And I think I've helped Karen with more foals than you ever have in just 1 year on Fool Watch. I think they wait for me. Well, do you know how not to have them? I mean, you must have noticed that you don't often see a pregnant herald, and well, hardly a celibate bunch. Yes, in answer to your second question, Talia said, thinking wryly of the nocturnal activities of her next-door neighbor, Destria. But no to your first. We've got something to heal us, make up for us, Cheryl said, obviously relieved that she wasn't going to have to explain the facts of life to her young friend. It's a powder. You take some every day, except when you're having moon days. It doesn't even taste bad, which is truly amazing considering the way most of their potions taste. You can also use it to adjust your cycles if you have to. If you know you're going to be in a situation where having your moon days would be really awkward, for instance, you just stop taking it earlier or keep on longer. I figured I'd better tell you about it, or it was possible no one would. I know you haven't needed it yet, but you might want it soon if the gleam I've been seeing in Skiff's eyes means anything. You remember to tell me this on the day you got your whites? Talia asked incredulously, ignoring the comment about Skiff. Oh, Sherry, whatever did I do to deserve a friend like you? The powder worked just as well as the little sponges Cheryl had shown her how to use in place of the rag clouts for moon days, and Talia was more than grateful to Cheryl for telling her about it. Being able to adjust her cycles was wonderful in and of itself, which was just as well, since she never really got a chance to test the efficacy of the other application. She and Skiff were so often thrown together that Talia had lost any self-consciousness around him, and had certainly long since unconsciously relegated him to the category of safe males, especially after the help he'd been with the Hulda affair. It helped that they were much of an age and size, and that the normally rowdy Skiff muted his voice and actions around her, as if being aware how easily she could be startled or frightened by a male. They had started out being quite good friends, but now he was being attracted to her in another way, as his mealtime behavior had so ardently demonstrated. So what occurred next between them was hardly surprising. After Talia had so nearly died in the icy water of the river, Ulbrich had assigned Cheryl to give her the same kind of swimming lessons a child of the lake would have. Cheryl's last act before going out on her internship was to surprise Talia on the bridge and toss her into the same spot she'd been thrown before. The water was almost as cold, though the ice was scarcely more than a thin skin among the reeds. Sherry stood ready to haul her out if she had to, but Talia passed this impromptu exam with flying colors and chattering teeth. Skiff met her coming back to her room, laughing, shaking with cold, barefoot and dripping, and wrapped in a horse blanket. "Holy stars!" he exclaimed in shock. "What happened to you?" "Sherry pushed me in the river. No, wait!" she forestalled his rushing off to mete out the same treatment to the innocent Cheryl. "It was on Ulbrich's orders. She's been teaching me what she knows, and she wanted a foolproof way of testing whether I'd learned or not." "Some test!" Skiff grumbled. Then, to Talia's surprise, picked her up and carried her to her room. "They don't ever let up on you, do they?" he complained, helping her out of her sodden clothing and building up the tiny fire in her room. "Holy stars, you do twice the work of the rest of us, and you never get a break, and then they turn around and do things like this to you." She turned unexpectedly and stumbled. He caught her, and she found herself staring into his brown eyes at a meager distance of an inch or two. He froze, then seized his opportunity and kissed her. They broke apart in confusion a long moment later. Talia," he mumbled. "I like you, Skiff," she said softly. "I like you a lot." "You do?" He flushed. You know I like you." "And you know who my next-door neighbor is? Nobody'd notice if we... you know." "You mean?" Skiff could hardly believe his ears, or his luck. "But you've got your good uniform on. You're going somewhere.
Tonight, maybe?
I've got a council meeting, but after that?
Alas for poor Skiff. The council meeting was long and boring, and Talia was a good deal more tired from Sherry's trial by water than she realized. She arrived at her room a little before him and sat down on her bed to rest. By the time he got there, much to Skiff's chagrin, she was fast asleep. He bit his lip in annoyance. Then his expression softened. He covered her carefully with a blanket and gave her a chaste kiss on one cheek. She was so weary, she didn't even stir.
"No matter, Lady-o," he whispered. "We can try again another time." "Bright havens, little one,"
Jadis exclaimed, seeing Talia's strained expression as she arrived for her nightly visit.
"What ails you?"
I'm not sure," she replied hesitantly. "But everyone's so angry. I thought I could keep it out, but it won't stay out."
"You should have said something sooner,"
he scolded gently, using his own gift to reinforce her shielding.
"Elkarth could have helped you."
Elkarth was busy, and everybody else was too angry to get near. Jadis, what's wrong with everyone? I thought Heralds didn't get angry. I've never felt anything like this before.
"That's because you weren't in any shape to sense the mood of the Collegium last winter, dear heart."
"You're changing the subject," Talia said, a bit tartly. "And if this affects Selenite or Elspeth, I need to know what it's all about."
Jadis hesitated, then sighed and concluded that she was right.
"It's not a pretty tale,"
he said.
"There's a young herald named Dirk who became infatuated with one of the court beauties. That's not too uncommon, especially the first time a herald is assigned to the court or collegium, but she apparently played on it, built it into something a great deal more serious on his part. And all the time she was simply toying with him, intended using him for the rather base end of getting at a friend of his. When she was found out, she said some very cruel things, deliberately came very close to destroying his fairly fragile ego. She totally shattered his self-esteem. She's got him convinced he's worth less than a mongrel dog. He's been sent back to his home for a while. Hopefully, in the company of his family and friends, he'll recover. I pray so. Dirk is a good lad, and a valuable herald, and worth 50 of her. I knew his father at Bardic, and the lad did me the service of visiting me now and again to pay his respects. The anger you feel is largely due to the fact that we are legally and ethically unable to mete out to that woman the punishment she richly deserves. And, child, we do get angry. We're only human, and it hurts to know we are helpless to avenge what has been done to one dear to us, because we obey the spirit and the letter of the law."
Talia left Jadis, deep in thought, wondering if she'd ever truly be worthy of that kind of caring. Skiff slipped Talia a note at breakfast. "My room tonight?" She smiled and nodded very slightly. He arrived at his room, Talia and the proposed rendezvous temporarily forgotten. He was battered, bruised, and sore from his head to his heels, and all he was really thinking about was whether or not he could coax Drake or Edric into bringing him something from the kitchen, so that he wouldn't have to drag his weary body to the common room. He blinked in surprise to see food and hot tea waiting on his desk. He blinked again to see Talia sitting on his bed.
"Oh, Lord of Lights, Talia, I forgot."
"I heard," she said simply. "But I thought you could use food and a friend. And we'll see if we can't get you in shape for other things with those two."
"He's a sadist, that old brick. Oh,"
he moaned, lowering himself, wincing into the chair and reaching for the tea.
"Time you had some responsibility," he said. "You're going to be my assistant," he said. it'll give you less time for picking of pockets and evil habits. He didn't say he'd be giving me extra lessons. He didn't say that he was going to make me the sparring partner for hulking brutes who've already gotten their whites. He didn't tell me I was going to be teaching three giants who never saw anything more sophisticated than a club. Holy stars, Talia, you should see those three. They were farmers, or so they tell me. Farmers, Talia. If you asked directions from one of them, he'd probably pick up the plough, ox and all, to point the way.
Talia murmured sympathetically and massaged his shoulders.
I hurt in places I didn't know I had,
he complained, eating his dinner with what for him was unnatural slowness. I might be able to help with that, Talia smiled, continuing to massage his aches. It was a short 2 steps to his bed. She got most of the clothing off him, and, not so incidentally, off herself. She had gotten hold of some kelwood oil and warmed it to skin temperature, using it to help get the knots out of his bruised and battered muscles. Under her gentle ministrations, he was even beginning to feel somewhat revived. Then he made the mistake of closing his eyes. Talia realized it was hopeless when she heard his gentle snores. She sighed, eased herself out of his bed, tucked him in like a child, and returned to her own room. This midwinter she stayed at the Collegium quite gladly, enjoying the unusual freedom to read until all hours of the night if she chose, and greatly enjoying Jadis's company. She discovered that this year Miro and Gaitha were remaining over the holiday, along with Karen and Ilsa, and the 6 of them often met in Jadis's room for long discussions over hot cider. Karen and Ilsa took her out with them on long rides into the countryside outside the capital. They even managed to persuade Jadis to accompany them on more than one of these expeditions, the first time he'd been off Collegium grounds for years. The 3 of them had found a pond that had frozen with a black ice surface as smooth as the finest mirror, while Ilsa and Jadis stayed by the fire they built on the shore, laughing at the other 2 and keeping a careful eye on the rabbit and roots they were roasting for a snow picnic. Karen taught Talia how to skate. With runners made of polished steel fastened to her boots, Karen glided on the surface of the pond with the grace of a falcon in flight. Talia fell down a lot, at least at first. "You're just trying to get back at me," she accused. "I never got a sore rear from riding, so you're trying some other way to make it hard for me to set down." Karen just chuckled, helped her up again, and resumed towing her around the pond. Eventually she acquired the knack of balancing, then of moving. By the time they quit to return home, she was thoroughly enjoying herself, even if she looked, as she said, more like a goose than a falcon. They repeated this trip nearly every other day, until by midwinter itself, Talia was proficient enough to be able to skate, shakily, backwards. Once again they shared the revelry in the servants' hall, this time with the other 4 as additions to the group. It was altogether a most satisfactory midwinter holiday. When classes resumed, she added one in law and jurisprudence, and another in languages, and lost the free hour in the library. Often it seemed as if there simply weren't enough hours in the day to do everything, but somehow she managed. Her bond with Rolan, if anything, continued to deepen. Now it seemed as if he was always present at the back of her mind. She knew by now that he was the source of some of the wisdom that she'd had spring unbidden into her mind when the Queen needed it, and that it had been Rolan who had guided her when she'd needed to bail Skiff out of Orthalin's ill graces. Rolan, after all, had the benefit of living in the mind of a man of great ability, the former King's Own, Talimir, for much of Talimir's life as a herald, and made all of that wisdom available to his new herald. Yet some of it, at least, was all Talia's own, the instinctive judgment that only the monarch's own herald possessed. Before she realized how much time had passed, the trees were budding again. There was a new crop of trainees, and Talia was amazed at how young these children looked. Sometimes she was just as surprised, when looking in a mirror, at how young she still looked, for she felt as if she must appear at least 100 years old by now. Spring did bring one respite. Karen had taught her all she knew. There would be no more equitation classes as such. From time to time she would help Karen with the younger students who needed individual help, but it was not the steady, draining demand that the class had been. Now that Karen was no longer Talia's teacher, their relationship ripened into an incredibly close friendship, closer even than the relationship Talia had had with her sister Vriss. For all of the difference in their ages, Karen was slightly more than twice Talia's age. They discovered that the difference was negligible once they really began to talk with one another. The closeness they had begun over the midwinter holiday began to deepen and strengthen. Talia found that Karen was the one person in the entire collegium with whom she felt free to unburden herself. Perhaps because Karen was strongly sympathetic to the weight of responsibility on the shoulders of the Queen's Own, having had that burden in her own family. Being able to say exactly what she pleased to somebody made life a great deal easier for Talia. As for Karen, Talia was one of the few people she'd ever met, even in the heraldic circle, who was willing to accept her relationship with Ilsa, and all that this implied, without judgment. Once Talia's loyalty was given, it was unswerving and unshakable. Most heralds liked and admired Karen, but many were uneasy about getting too close to her, as if her preferences were some kind of stain that might rub off on them. Talia was one of the few who gave her heart freely and openly to one she considered to be her best friend. And with Ilsa so often away, life up until now had been rather lonely. A loneliness Talia did much to alleviate, simply by being there. Talia learned something new about her friend, something that few guessed. The outward strength and capability of the riding instructor masked the internal fragility of a snowflake. Her emotional stability rested on a tripod of 3 bonds, the one with Terran, the one with Dantris, her companion, and the one with Ilsa. It was partially because of that the Circle had assigned the twins to teaching full-time at the Collegium when the advance of middle years made it time to think of taking them from field duty, although the primary reasons were that they were experts in their areas, Karen with equitation and Terran for his talents in dealing with children and true gift for teaching. There was very little chance that anything untoward would occur to either Dantris or her brother here. Ilsa had been given her own assignment as special messenger because of the unusual endurance of Falara, second only to Rolan's, though it was true that the duty of special messenger was not as hazardous as many of the others, which had again been a minor consideration. Still, Talia often thought with a vague dread that if anything ever happened to Ilsa, Karen might well follow. The night was warm. It was too early for insects. The moon was full. It was an altogether idyllic setting. There was even a lovely, soft bed of young ferns to spread their cloaks on. Talia had met Skiff quite by accident when she was coming back from walking with Elspeth in Companion's Field. With unspoken accord, they had retraced their steps and found this ideal trysting place.
Comfortable?
Mm-hmm. And the stars?
They're gorgeous. I could watch them forever.
I thought, Talia teased, that you had something else in mind.
Oh, I did?
But he had just spent his afternoon dodging Albric, and she had been up since well before dawn. Talia returned his hesitant but gentle caresses. She was both excited and a little apprehensive about this, but from the way Skiff was acting, she evidently wasn't being too awkward. She began to relax for the first time since early that morning, and she could feel the tension in his shoulders begin to go out. And they fell asleep simultaneously. They woke with dew soaking them and birds overhead and the sun just beginning to rise.
I hate to say this, Skiff began with a sigh.
I know. This isn't going to work, is it?
I guess not. It's either the gods, fate, or the imp of the perverse.
Or all 3. I guess we're stuck just being good friends. Well, you can't say we didn't try. To Skiff's delight,
Their classmates seemed totally unaware of the fact that their trysts had been abortive. Talia was thought of as being very hard to get. Skiff was amazed to discover that his reputation had been made as a consequence and proceeded immediately to try to live up to it. Coincident with this, Albrecht dropped him as assistant and appointed Jerry, so he never again had the problem that had plagued his romance with Talia. Talia simply smiled and held her peace when teased about Skiff, so their secret remained a secret. The death bell tolled 4 times that year. Talia found herself in a new role, one that she hadn't expected. She'd attended the funeral of the first of that year's victims. It was just turning autumn. The air still had the feel of summer during the day, although the nights were growing colder. She had gone to Companion's Field afterward and had mounted Rolan without saddling him. They had not ambled along, as was their usual habit. It was rather as if something was drawing both of them to a particular corner of the field. Companion's Field was not, as the name implied, a simple flat field. Rather, it was a rolling, partially wooded complex of several acres in size, containing the stable for foul-weather shelter, the barn and granary holding the Companion's fodder, and the tack shed. In reality, a substantial building with fireplaces at either end. The heart of the field was the grove, the origin place of the original companions, and the location of the tower containing the death bell. There were several spring-fed creeks and pools and many secluded, shady copses, as well as more open areas. Talia's feelings led her to one of those secluded corners, a tiny pool at the bottom of an equally tiny valley, all overhung with golden-leaved willows. There was a herald there, his own companion nuzzling anxiously at his shoulder, staring vacantly into the water of the pool. Talia dismounted and sat next to him. "Would you like to talk about it?" she asked, after a long silence. He tossed a scrap of bark into the pool.
"I found him. Garrick, I mean."
"Bad?"
"I can't even begin to tell you. Whatever killed him can't have been human, not even close. And the worst of it was—"
"Go on."
"It was my circuit he was riding. If I hadn't broken my leg, it would have been me. Maybe."
"You don't think so?"
"There's been some odd things going on out there on the western border, especially on my circuit. I tried to warn him, but he just laughed and told me I'd been out there too long. Maybe if it had been me out there, I don't know."
Talia remained silent, knowing there was more he hadn't said.
"I can't sleep anymore,"
the herald said at last, and indeed he looked haggard.
"Every time I close my eyes, I see his face, the way he was when I found him. The blood, the pain, damn it to all the 12 hells!" He drove his fist into the ground beside him. "Why did it have to be Garrick? Why? I'd never seen anybody so much in love with life. Why did he have to die like that?"
"I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't," Talia replied. "I think we'll only know the way of things when we meet our own fates." Her voice trailed off as she searched for words to bring him some kind of comfort. "But surely, if he loved life as much as you say, Garrick must have made the most of every minute he had."
"You know, you're right. I used to dig at him for it. Sometimes he'd just laugh and tell me that since he didn't know what was around the corner, he planned to make the most of whatever he had at the moment. I swear it seemed sometimes as if he were trying to live 3 men's lives all at once. Why, I remember a time when—"
He continued with a string of reminiscences, at times almost oblivious of Talia's presence except as an ear in which to pour his words. He only stopped when his throat grew dry, and he realized with a start that he'd been talking for at least a couple of hours.
"Lord of the Mountain, what have I been telling you?"
he said, seeing for the first time that his companion was only an adolescent girl.
"Look, I'm sorry. What is your name?"
"Talia," she replied, and smiled as his eyes widened a little in recognition. "There's nothing to apologize for, you know. All I've been doing is listening. But now you're remembering your friend as he lived instead of as he died. Isn't that a better memorial?"
"Yes,"
he said thoughtfully.
"Yes."
The strain was gone from his face, and she could no longer sense the kind of tearing, destructive unhappiness that had led her here. There was sorrow, yes, but not the kind that would obsess and possess him. "I've got to go now, and you should get some sleep before you're ill." She swung up on Roland's back as he raised eyes that mirrored his gratitude to meet hers.
"Thank you, Queen's Own," was all he said, but the tone of his voice said much more.
The second herald to die that year fell victim to an avalanche, but the lover he'd left behind had to be convinced that he hadn't been taking foolish risks because they'd quarreled previously. That was an all-night session, and Talia appeared at her first class looking so dragged out that the now Herald Nerissa, who was teaching it, ordered her back to bed and cancelled all her morning work. The third meant another soul-searching session with Selene, guilt-racked over having sent, this time, a young and inexperienced herald into something she would never have been able to cope with, an explosive feud between two families of the lesser nobility of the East. It had devolved into open warfare between them, and while trying to reconcile the two parties, the herald had gotten in the way of a stray arrow. Had she had more experience, she would not have so exposed herself. Of course, Selene had had no way of knowing that the feud had gotten that heated at the time she sent Beryl, but with the clear vision imparted by hindsight, she felt that she should have guessed. But for the fourth, just after midwinter holiday, it was Talia herself that was in dire need of comfort, for the herald who died was Jadis. She'd awakened one morning before dawn, knowing immediately that something was wrong, that it involved Jadis, and had only taken enough time to pull her cloak on over her bedgown before running to his room. She all but ran into a healer leaving it, and his eyes told her the truth. Jadis's passing had been quite peaceful, he told her. Jadis had had no inkling of it, simply hadn't awakened. His companion was also gone, probably simultaneously. None of this was any comfort at all. She retreated to her room and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the chair he'd spent so many nights occupying, guarding her in her illness. She thought of all the things that she wished now she'd told him, how much he had meant to her, how much she'd learned from him. It was too late for any of that now, and too late to thank him.
"Lovey, I heard."
Karen stood beside her. Talia hadn't even noticed the door opening. As they stared at one another, the bell began to toll. As if the bell tone had released something, Talia began to cry soundlessly. Karen held her on the edge of the bed, and they wept together for their old friend and for all that he'd meant to both of them. Karen was not the only one to think of Talia when the news spread, for when they looked up at a small sound, Dean Elkarth had taken the chair across from Talia's bed.
"I have to tell you 2 things, my dear," he said with a little difficulty. "Jadis was a long-time friend of mine. He was my counselor on my internship, in fact. He left all of his affairs in my hands. He knew he hadn't much longer to live, and he told me when. He wanted you to have—"
Mutely, he held out the harp case that held my lady. Talia took it in trembling hands and stared at it, unable to speak around the lump of tears in her throat.
"The other thing is this. He was happier these past 2 years than at any time since he lost his leg. When it came to strict academic subjects, he wasn't a very good teacher. His heart just wasn't in it. The classes we had him teach were just to keep him busy, and he knew it. Until you came, he'd been retreating more and more into the past, living in a time when he'd been useful. You made him feel useful again. And when you were sick, I don't think you realize how much you're needing him, both to guard your safety and to chase the nightmares away with his music, made him alive again. And being able to counsel and guide you,
It meant the world to him.
He knew? He knew how much I needed him?
Of course he knew. He had the thought-sensing gift. No matter how well you think you shield, youngling, when you care for someone the way you two cared for each other, things are bound to get through. Will you, nill you? And when you started coming to him for advice, or for help, and when he was the one you came to over the Hulda affair, I don't think he was ever proud of anything he'd done. He often told me he no longer missed not having a family, because now he had a family in you and in the friends you'd brought to him. He was a very lonely man until you came to his door, little one. He died a happy and contented man.
Elkarth dropped his head and rubbed briefly at his eyes, unable to say more.
I have to go,
he said finally, and stood up. Talia caught his hand.
Thank you,
she whispered. He squeezed her hand in acknowledgement and left. It was several months before she could bring herself to touch my lady, but once she had, though she missed Jadis dreadfully every time she played, she never once neglected to practice. And when she did, she tried to remember him as he'd been that night, alert and alive, in the chair next to her bed with his harp on his lap and a loaded crossbow hidden on the floor beside him, with his old cane exchanged for one that held concealed the blade of a sword. And the incredulous smile of joy that had appeared when she had begged him to play for her, or the way he'd looked when he told her and Skiff that they could leave the problem of Hulda in his hands, strong again, confident again, needed. And the laughter and joy they'd shared that midwinter day when Karen had taught her to skate. Sometimes it even helped a little, but only sometimes. Chapter 11.
Trape, I'm late,
Talia swore to herself, finally noticing the time by the sundial in the garden beneath her window. She gathered up the scattered notes around her desk, coerced them into a more or less neat pile, and flew out the door of her room. She'd managed to learn a few shortcuts in the 3 years she'd been at the collegium. That, and longer legs, managed to get her to her classroom scant seconds ahead of Herald Ilsa and the dean. She ran her fingers through her unruly curls, hoping to smooth them down enough that her race through the holes wouldn't be blazoned in her appearance. 3 years had made quite a difference in the way she looked. The awkward adolescent, whose arms and legs had always seemed a bit too long for her body, was gone. Though she'd never be tall, growth and Albrecht's training had honed her into a slender, supple, and athletic young woman. The face she showed to the world was self-confident, but that outward appearance covered a certain shyness and uncertainty that still remained. The muddy color of her hair had finally turned to a rich red-brown. She wore it just touching her shoulders. Much to her dismay, since she secretly yearned for straight, midnight black hair like Cheryl's, it had remained stubbornly curly. Her eyes now matched her hair, and while she would never be called beautiful, she charmed everyone when she smiled, which she did now more often than not. There was no one in the collegium or among the full heralds of the circle who were acquainted with her who did not care deeply for her. The older trainees had taken it upon themselves to make it pointedly clear to the Blues that anyone harassing her would find life very uncomfortable indeed. Her teachers tried to keep her challenged, but at the same time went out of their way to coordinate their efforts so as to make it possible for her to keep up with all her commitments. The younger students, for she always had a moment to spare to soothe an anger, encourage the discouraged, or lend an ear to the homesick, frankly adored her. Her own contemporaries had formed a kind of honor guard for her headed by Griffin, always at hand to take over a chore or duty when the inevitable conflicts arose. She returned all these attentions with an artless gratitude and affection that made it seem a privilege to have helped her. And yet she still felt a kind of isolation from everyone but her few close friends, Skiff, Karen, Sherry, and Jerry. It was almost as if she was of the collegium and circle, yet not truly at one with them. A great part of that feeling had to do with the fact that it seemed to her as if she were continually receiving the affection and attention she so ardently craved, and yet was doing little or nothing to earn it. Exposing Hulda had been mostly Skiff's work. Civilizing Elspeth had been largely a matter of forcing her to take the consequences of her actions and returning her to her previous behavior patterns. It hardly seemed to her that being Selene's sounding board required much effort on her part. She felt, when she had time to think about it, as if she would never truly belong until she earned her place, entirely by her own efforts, and by doing something for the benefit of the circle that no one else could do. She little realized that, by helping to ease the emotional turmoils of others, she was already accomplishing just that. As far as she was concerned, that was the kind of thing anyone would and could do under the same circumstances. Only Elkarth, Herald Kyril, who made a study of heraldic gifts, and Ilsa realized how rare her abilities and her gift were, and how badly they would miss her were she not there. But since she still kept most of her inmost doubts to herself, none of them realized she felt this way. They saw only the cheerful exterior that she presented to the world at large. Only Karen and Rolan ever witnessed the bouts of self-doubt and temper, the fits of self-pity and depression, and neither of those two, like Jadis before them, was likely to betray her trust, since it was given so rarely. For if she had a fault, it was this. Even after 3 years, it was still hard for her to truly trust in others. Today marked a new phase of her studies, and a strange and somewhat frightening one. Now she was to learn the full use of that ability to sense the distresses of others that had appeared so abruptly under stress. Today was the beginning of her lessons in Herald's magic. There were 3 others in the class besides herself. The twins, Drake and Edric, from her own year group. Talia was still unable to tell them apart. And a silent, flame-haired lad from the year group following Talia's. Neve's abilities had caused mild havoc among the trainees for a brief period, until he had been identified as the source of disturbance. He was a projector, and he'd inadvertently projected his own nightmares into the dreams of those around him that were at all receptive and unshielded. Since his life up until he'd been chosen had been rough enough to make even the ex-street urchin Skiff blanch, his nightmares had been grown in fertile ground and given his fellow students several sleepless and terror-filled nights. As the dean and Herald entered the room, Talia found she had tensed up all over. These were new and strange waters she was about to dive into. She'd more or less come to terms with the simpler manifestations of her gift, but there remained her old hold training to deal with. To Holder folk, such abilities were unnatural at best and demon-born at worst. Talia was just grateful that the class was being taught by 2 so familiar to her. If it had been a stranger facing her, she would have been ready to have a litter of kittens with nerves. She tried to relax. This was nothing to fear. Every herald had to learn the working of his or her gift, and Elkarth caught her eye and gave her a brief, encouraging smile. Dean Elkarth surveyed the 4 of them, noting their understandable nervousness. Only Drake and Edric appeared to be more excited than ill at ease, but then their gift had been a part of them since birth. He smiled reassuringly at Neve and Talia, lifted an eyebrow at the twins, and began his usual speech.
We put the 4 of you in a class together because you all demonstrate gifts in the same family of talents,
the dean began, as his bright, round eyes met each of theirs in turn.
Your gifts of what we call magic are all in the areas of communication. I want you all to know that although we refer to these things in the world outside these walls as magic, there is nothing whatsoever unnatural about them. You have talents, even as a bard, an artist, or an artisan. You should never be afraid of what you have been gifted with. Rather, you should learn how to use these gifts to the benefit of yourselves and others.
Talia and Neve already know Herald Ilsa. She was instrumental in discovering that both of you had prematurely awakened gifts, since she is one of the best at the using and detecting communications-type abilities that we have among the Circle. For this reason, she will be in charge of this class, and I am merely here to assist her. Don't be afraid to ask her questions. Despite her formidable reputation, she doesn't bite.
Not hard, anyway,
Ilsa interrupted with a smile. And if she doesn't know the answers to your questions, she certainly knows exactly where to look and who to ask. I'll be helping her, since next to Herald Kirill, I'm probably the second choice for an expert at the Collegium. Ilsa, the floor is yours.
Well, she said, folding her arms and leaning back against the edge of the desk, where shall I start? Have any of you questions about all this?
Herald, Neve's expression was troubled. All this magic, it isn't evil, is it?
Is a crossbow evil? She countered.
Depends on who's holding it, Herald. One of the twins grinned and answered. And who it's pointed at.
Exactly. Your gifts can be used for evil purposes. They're just like any weapon, and make no mistake about it. They can be weapons if you're so minded. But you wouldn't be sitting here now if you were inclined toward evil. Trust the judgment of your companion in that, Neve, if you don't trust your own. They don't choose where evil is. And on the very rare occasion where someone has been corrupted past redemption, and the last was 200 years ago, they will repudiate their chosen. So, since you and Kildathar still seem on very good terms, I think I can set your mind at rest about being evil.
Herald, the companions seem to be able to make our gifts stronger somehow, said the other twin. Edric and I could talk a little to each other before, but since we were chosen, it's been much clearer and easier. Good,
Ilsa nodded. I wondered if any of you had made that connection. Yes, the companions seem to strengthen our gifts and develop the ones that are latent. You'll probably find that your gift gains enormously in power when you're in physical contact with your companion, and when you're under the influence of very strong emotions. No one is sure whether there's a connection there, between our bonds with our companions and very strong emotions. Our gifts are, unfortunately, not the kinds of things that yield easily to measurement.
Herald Ilsa, we've all seen or heard about the truth spell. Are we going to learn spells? Talia asked. My folk say all spells are demon work. Yes, you will be learning spells of a sort, though probably not what the Holder folk had in mind. What we call a spell, for the most part, is an exercise that forces you to concentrate. When you concentrate, you boost your capability. It's as simple as that. The word spell is just a handy term. In point of fact, most of them are rather like meditation chants or prayers of a sort.
Then does everybody have this kind of gift?
Neve asked. Again, yes. The catch is that most people don't have enough of the ability for it to be really useful to them. It's just like Talia sings very well, but will never be a bard, and I throw a decent pot, but could never be a really good potter. As far as that goes, there are some of us whose gifts are hardly stronger than those of non-heralds, and even among heralds a really powerful gift is rare, though we all have enough to enable us to bond with our companions and use the truth spell. From what we can tell, it seems to be that the very strongest gifts tend to be associated with those who become healers rather than heralds, although the gifts of communication are very similar to the healing gifts. That is why, in an emergency, you may be called on to assist healers. Sometimes the very strongest of our variety of gifts hide themselves. I've known a case or two when persistent inability has actually hidden very strong ability. Mostly, though, it seems that contact with your companion triggers your gift, and continued development of the bond also develops the gift to the point where you have direct conscious control of it. Once you can control it, you can be trained in the use of it, and you can learn its limits. Oh, I think I should mention something about the truth spell. That really is a spell, in the sense of the bardic tales. It requires a gift to use, apparently the one that makes the companion-herald bond possible.
If you have a strong gift, you'll be able to use it to actually force someone to speak only the truth. If your gift is weak, you'll only be able to detect whether or not a person is lying. The truth spell will be the last thing we'll teach you. Now, if you're all ready, I think we're about at that point where we should stop talking and start doing. For once, learning did not come easily to Talia. To her extreme frustration, mastering the use of her gift proved to be far more elusive than she had dreamed. The others quickly outstripped her in progress as she strove to get some kind of control on her abilities. Directing her gift seemed to be a greatly different thing than simply blocking it or letting it direct her actions passively, as she had been doing. It seemed to require a kind of combination of relaxation and concentration that she despaired of ever mastering. Several weeks passed without her attaining much more control than she had had before the class started. "You know," Ilsa said one day with a look as if she were slowly realizing something that should have been obvious, "I think we're going after the wrong gift. I'm not at all sure now that your prime gift is thought-sensing." "Well, what could it be?" Talia cried in frustration. "Everything you've told me and what I've seen for myself points not to the mind, but the heart. Look, your own mind call to Rolan was fear. The times with Selene and other heralds, sorrow, pain, loss, even what you picked up from me was an emotion. Love, or maybe lust." She winked at Talia, who coughed politely and blushed, "since I'm not sure exactly what you were getting from me that time, and it had been a long trip. Seriously, though, you can hear thoughts if you're properly prepared or you're in deep trance, but what you receive first and strongest is emotion. When there's no emotion involved, and there hasn't been in these training sessions, it's that much harder for you to receive meaning. I didn't think about that, because the gift for emotion sensing, we call it empathy, is almost never seen alone, or in a chosen. The only times I can ever remember seeing it is in company with the gift of true healing, and the companions never choose someone with the healing gifts, probably because they're needed too much as healers. What have I been telling you to do all this time?" "Relax and clear my mind of everything," Talia said, beginning to grasp what Ilsa was saying, "and especially to clear my mind of emotions, even the ones coming in from outside. So, naturally you fail. Our gifts are tricky things, you know. They depend very strongly on how much we believe in our own abilities. When you failed, you disbelieved a little and made it that much harder the next time. It's time we abandoned this tack and tried something different." "Like what?" "You'll see. Just keep your shields down. If all this isn't moonshine, I don't want you expecting anything in particular and maybe having your imagination supply it for you." Ilsa turned to Neve and whispered in his ear. He nodded and left the room, while Talia waited with half-perplexed anticipation for something to happen. Suddenly, she was inundated by terror, and hard upon the terror came a picture, and then it was something more than a picture. It was a vision of a filthy, smoke-filled taproom, a vision that she was a part of, for the room around her and her fellows had vanished. All around her loomed the slack bodies of drunken, half-crazed people, mostly men, but with a few slatternly women sprawled among them. They were very much bigger than she. She seemed to have shrunk down to the size of a 10-year-old. She was trying to slip through them with as little stir as possible, serving their cheap wine, when one of them woke from his daze and seized her arm in a grip that hurt.
"Come here, little boy, pretty boy," he crooned, ignoring her struggles to free herself. "I only want to give you something."
She wanted to scream, knowing very well what it was he wanted, but found her throat so choked with fear that she could barely squeak. It was like a nightmare from which there could be no awakening. She began losing herself completely in panic when something broke the spell she was in. "Talia!" Ilsa was shaking her, slapping her face lightly. "Talia, block it out!" "Goddess!" Talia slumped in her seat and held her head in both hands. "What happened?" "I told Neve to project the most emotional image he could think of at you," Ilsa said a bit grimly.
We succeeded better than I had guessed we would. You not only received it, you were trapped by it. Well, that answers that question. Your gift is empathy, beyond all doubt. And now that we know for certain what your gift is, we can do more about training you properly." "Lady of Light," Talia said, burying her face in her hands. Poor Neve. If you'd seen what I saw, how can such filth be allowed to exist?"
"It's not here."
Neve himself came through the door, looking quite ordinary, far calmer, far more natural than Talia would have believed possible for someone whose mind held such memories.
"I'm from Out Kingdom, remember? Where I come from, an orphan child of the poor is fair game for whatever anyone wants to do with him. So long as the priests and the peacekeepers aren't officially aware of what's going on, and there's no one to speak for the child, just about anything is tolerated. Are you all right? I could tell something was wrong, but not what. I stopped sending, but you'd already broken off contact. Talia, you had an awfully strong hold on me. I found myself reliving the whole filthy episode."
"Neve, I'm so sorry."
She strove to express her horror at what he'd gone through, and failed utterly. He touched her arm hesitantly, his eyes understanding.
"Talia, it was long ago and far away. Thanks to people like Ilsa and the Dean, it doesn't even hurt that much anymore. I know now, it wasn't anything I did that caused it."
He licked his lips, his calm shell cracking just a little.
"Time does heal things, you know. Time and love and help. I just wish that I could somehow make sure that nothing like that ever happens to another child." "Someday, we hope, that's exactly what the Heralds will accomplish," the Dean said gravely. "Someday, when there isn't a kingdom on this world that doesn't welcome us. But for now, well, Neve, we save the ones we can, and try not to think too hard about the others, the ones we couldn't save. We can't be everywhere."
But Elkarth's eyes told them how little it helped at times to know that, and how hard it was to forget the ones still trapped in their little hells. Eventually Ilsa declared the class to be officially over, saying that there was nothing else she could actually teach them. Now their proficiency depended on their own limits and how well they honed their gifts with practice. The end of the class meant that it was time to learn the only real magic that they were ever likely to see. It was time to learn the truth spell. Legend says this was discovered by a contemporary of Herald Vanyel just before the incursions of the Dark Servants, she told them. Since Vanyel himself was the last of what were called the heraldic mages, this is the last real bit of magic ever created in Valdemar, and is about all the real magic we have left, except for a few things the priests and healers use. Most of the rest was lost to the Dark Servants, abandoned because of negative associations, or just plain forgotten. In some ways, it's too bad. It would be nice to still be able to build a fortress like the Palace Collegium complex and to pave roads the way the old ones did. At any rate, this spell starts with a cantrip, a little rhyme, just like some of the others you've learned. With the rhyme came an image they were to hold in their minds, one that made very little sense to Talia, the image of a wisp of fog with blue eyes. While holding this image, they were to recite the rhyme mentally 9 times, no more, no less. On the 9th repetition, they were to imagine the fog enveloping the person they were casting the spell on. Ilsa demonstrated on Dean Elkarth, closing her own eyes briefly, then staring fixedly at him for a few moments. Within a few heartbeats, Elkarth was surrounded by a faint but readily visible glowing blue nimbus of light. "I've just put the first stage on him," Ilsa told them. "I'm not forcing the truth out of him, but just registering whether or not he's telling it. Lie for me, Elkarth." "I'm passionately in love with you, Ilsa." The glow vanished, while Ilsa and her students laughed. "Now, tell me the truth. I consider you to be one of the most valuable assets of the circle, but I'm rather glad you're not my life mate. You're altogether too difficult a woman, and you have a nasty temper." The glow reappeared, and Ilsa sighed dramatically. "Ah, Elkarth,
And here all this time I'd been hoping you secretly cared."
"Elkarth, sir, can you see what we're seeing?" Neve asked curiously.
"Not so much as a glimmer," he replied. "But anyone except the person bespelled sees the glow, whether or not they've got a gift. Why don't you invoke the second stage, Ilsa?"
"If you're ready for it." Again she stared at him. Talia could see no perceptible change in the glow surrounding him. "How old are you, Elkarth? Try to tell me 20. His face twisted with strain, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead.
"T-t-t," he stuttered.
57. He sighed heavily.
"I'd forgotten what it felt like to try and fight truth spell, Ilsa. Take it off, would you? Before I get tricked into revealing something I shouldn't."
"Now why would I do something like that to you?" she teased, then closed her eyes briefly again, and the glow was gone. "You banish the spell easily enough. Just picture the cloud lifting away from the person, close its eyes, and dissipate. You all have gifts strong enough to bring both stages of the spell to bear," she said a moment later. "So, why don't you start practicing? Neve and Talia with me, the twins with Elkarth." The feeling of having the second stage of the truth spell cast on her was decidedly eerie, Talia found. No matter what she had intended to say, she found her tongue would not obey her. Only the exact truth came out. In cases where she didn't know the answer to a question, she was even forced to say so, rather than temporize. At last Ilsa declared them all proficient enough to close the class out. "You know the spells. Though if we find out you've been using the truth spell as a prank, you'll find yourself in very hot water, so don't even consider it. Practice it if you wish, but do so only under the supervision of a full herald. You know where your strengths and weaknesses lie," she continued. "Just like sparring practice will make you a better fighter, practicing with your gifts will develop them to their full extent. If you run into any problems that are related to your gifts, there are 3 of us who are probably the experts. You can come to any of us, day or night, if it's an emergency. Myself, when I'm at the Collegium, the Dean, or Herald Kirill, the Seneschal's Herald. There are books in the library as well that may help. I recommend you go up there and follow your instincts. Certainly you'll learn more about the abstract theory of our gifts from them than you will from me, if that's what you want. I never was one for theory. I leave that up to Kirill. He enjoys trying to ferret out the whys and hows of our gifts. I'm content with just knowing the usages, and never mind how it works." Theirs was the first of the 3 groups being taught to finish formal training. The other 2 were much smaller, the communication gifts being by far and away the most common and contained, respectively. Griffin and a younger girl, Christa, and Devon with one of Christa's yearmates, a boy called Wolf. Talia was extremely curious about these other gifts and asked Ilsa about them as the last class broke up. "The other 2 general groups have to do with moving things with thought alone and seeing at a distance," Ilsa said. "We tend to lump them under the names of fetching and sight. Oddly enough, the 2 heralds best at both those skills happen to work together as a team, Dirk and Chris. Well, maybe it's not so odd. Gifts that are needed tend to appear just before they're needed." The second name woke a vague feeling of recollection. After a moment of thought, Talia remembered that she'd met Chris before, her first night at the Collegium. "Chris is the one that's too good-looking to be true, isn't he?" she asked Ilsa with a half-smile. "That's the one. The fact that Dirk and Chris are partners is one reason why we hold these classes, particularly the latter 2. All at the same time and for more than 1 year group. It makes more sense to wait for a time of several weeks when Dirk and Chris don't have to be out somewhere," Ilsa replied. "Why are you asking?" "Insatiable curiosity," Talia confessed. "I kind of wonder how their gifts are related to my own. Seeing's probably the closest. Emotions are powerful attractants for the mind's eye. In fact, you may have more than a touch of that particular gift yourself, as you've noticed. I've told you that no one ever has just one gift with no hint of the others, haven't I? You've got enough thought sensing and sight to possibly be useful in an emergency. Maybe just a hint of healing as well. Anyway, the difference between their gifts and yours is that you will generally have to see things through the eyes of someone present, unless there's a lot of emotional residuum to hold you, and then it will be very vague. They can see things as if they were observing them directly, even if there's nobody there. There isn't much to watch in that class, though, just the three of them sitting around in trance states. Quite boring if you're not linked in with them. Dirk's class is something else altogether. That's something to see. I know he won't mind. Want to peek in on them?
Could I?
Talia didn't even try to conceal her eagerness. I don't see any reason why not. Queen's Own should probably see some of the other gifts in action, especially since it seems your yearmate Griffin has one of the rarer and potentially more dangerous of the fetching family.
He does? What does he do?
Talia found it difficult to envision the good-natured Griffin as dangerous. He's a fire starter. Because of Griffin's gift, Dirk was holding his classes outside, away from any building and near the well, just in case. Talia could see he had a bucket of water on the cobblestones beside him. He and his two pupils were sitting cross-legged on the bare paving, all three seeming to be too engrossed in what they were doing to notice any discomfort from the stone. He nodded agreeably to Ilsa and Talia as they approached, indicating with an eyebrow a safe place to stand and watch, and then turned his attention immediately back to his two pupils. Talia discovered to her surprise that she recognized Herald Dirk as the young herald she'd encountered just outside the capital. She had been far too overcome with bashfulness and the fear that she'd been wrongdoing to take more than a cursory look at him then. She took the opportunity afforded by his deep involvement with his pupils to do so now. Her initial impression of homeliness was totally confirmed. His face looked like a clay model that had been constructed by someone with little or no talent at all. His nose was much too long for his face. His ears looked as if they'd just been stuck on by guess and then left there. His jaw was square and didn't match his rather high cheekbones. His teeth looked like they'd be more at home in his companion's mouth than in his. His forehead didn't match any of the rest of his face. It was much too broad, and his overly generous mouth was lopsided. His straw-colored hair looked more like the thatched roof of a cottage, provided that the thatcher hadn't had the least notion of what he'd been about. The only thing that redeemed him from being repulsive was the good-natured smile that always hovered around the corners of his mouth, a smile that demanded that the onlooker smile in response. That and his eyes. He had the most beautiful eyes Talia had ever seen, brimming with kindness and compassion. The only eyes she could compare them to were Roland's, and they were the same living sapphire blue as a companion's. If she hadn't been so fascinated by what was transpiring, she might have paused to wonder at the strength of response she felt to the implied kindness of those eyes. As it was, though, Griffin was in the process of demonstrating his gift, and that drove any other thought from her head. He seemed to be working his way up through progressively less combustible materials. It was evident from some of the residue of this exercise that he'd already attained the control required to ignite normally volatile substances at will. In front of him were the remains of burned paper, shredded cloth, the tarry end of a bit of rope, and a charred piece of kindling wood. Now Dirk placed in front of him an odd black rock.
"This stuff will burn if you get it hot enough, I promise you," he was saying to Griffin. "Smiths use it sometimes to get a really hot fire. They prefer it over charcoal. Give it a try."
Griffin stared at the bit of black stone, his face intent. After a tense moment, he sighed explosively.
"It's no use," he began. "You're trying too hard again," Dirk admonished. "Relax. It's no different than what you did with the wood. The stuff's just a bit more stubborn. Give it longer."
Once again Griffin stared at the lump. Then something extraordinary happened. His eyes suddenly unfocused, and Talia's stomach flipped over. She became disoriented for a moment. The experience was something rather as if she'd been part of the mating of two dissimilar objects into a new whole. The black lump ignited with a preternatural and explosive fury.
"Whoa!"
Dirk shouted, dousing the fire with the handy bucket of water. It had burned with such heat that the stone beneath it sizzled and actually cracked when the water hit it. There was a smell of scorched rock and steam rising in a cloud from the place it had been. Griffin's eyes refocused, and he stared at the blackened area dumbfounded.
"Did I do that?" "You certainly did. Congratulations," Dirk said cheerfully. "Now you see why we have this class outside. More importantly, can you do it again, and with a little more control this time?" "I think so."
Griffin's eyes once again took on the abstracted appearance they'd had before, and the soaked remains of the black rock sizzled, then began merrily burning away, in sublime indifference to the puddle around them.
"Now, damp it,"
Dirk commanded. The flames died completely. In seconds the rock was cool enough for Dirk to pick up.
"Well done, youngling,"
Dirk applauded.
"You've got the trick of it now. With practice, you'll be able to call fire right out of the air if you want, but don't try yet. That's enough for today. Any more and you'll have a headache."
The headaches were something Ilse had warned Talia's class about, the direct result of overextending a gift. Sometimes this was unavoidable, but for the most part, it was better not to court them. Drake had gotten one day, showing off. His example had reinforced that prohibition. Ilse had given them each a packet of herbs to make into a tea that deadened the worst of the pain should they miscalculate and develop one anyway, and had told them that Miro kept a further supply on hand in the kitchen when they ran out.
"Now, Christa, your turn."
Dirk moved his attention to the lanky, coltish girl to his left.
"There's a message tube, the mate to this one."
He laid a Herald's message container of the kind that special messengers usually carried on their belts in front of her.
"On the top of the first bookcase in the library. It's lying along the top of Spun of Shadow. I know this is bigger than anything you've tried before, but the distance is a bit less than you've reached in the past. Think you can visualize it and bring it here?"
She nodded without speaking, and took the message tube in her hands. There was a growing feeling of tension once again. It was plainly perceptible to Talia. She felt as if she were in the middle of two people pulling on her mind. Then came a kind of popping noise. Now not one but two message tubes lay in Christa's hands. Dirk took the new one from her and opened it. He displayed the contents to her with a grin. A small slip of parchment with the words, "Exercise 1 and well begun" on it. Christa's grin of accomplishment echoed Dirk's.
"Not good poetry, but the sentiment's right. Well, you managed that one. Now let's see if you can get a little farther."
Ilse nudged Talia, who nodded reluctantly, and both moved quietly away.
"Gifts like Griffin's have been known to wreak absolute havoc if the owner fails to learn how to control them," Ilse said gravely, once they were out of earshot. "There have been instances in the past when the trainee's teacher, unprepared perhaps for the kind of explosion we saw today, reacted with fear that the pupil in turn reacted to. Sometimes that causes the pupil to block his gift entirely, making it impossible for him to learn full control, and then at some later date, during a moment of stress or crisis, it flares up again with a fury that has to be seen to be believed. We've been very fortunate in that this fury has always been turned against the enemies of the kingdom in the past."
"Laban Firestorm," Talia said in comprehension. "I remember now. He almost single-handedly drove back the dark servants at the Battle of Whitefowl Pass. But at Burning Pines his companion was killed, and the last firestorm he called up consumed him as well as the enemy. There's nothing but bare rock at Burning Pines to this day. Those who were there were just lucky he retained enough hold on his sanity to warn them before he called down the fires. And there's no guarantee that the firestorm couldn't be turned against friends as well as enemies. Rage can often be blind. That's why Dirk makes such a good teacher. He never shows the slightest sign of fear to his pupils. We're lucky to have him in the circle," Ilse replied. "At any rate, you've got weapons drill to go to, and I have to report that I'm free for reassignment. I'll see you at dinner, kitten." Talia continued to practice every night, choosing times when the sometimes volatile emotions of the students of the collegium were damped by the weariness of day's end. For several weeks she simply observed what she was drawn to. though a time or two she quickly chose some other subject to observe after her initial contact proved highly intimate and rather embarrassing. When she became more sure of herself, though, she was tempted by encountering the fear of one of the youngest students' nightmares to try intervening. To her great delight, she was successful in turning the fear away. Without that stimulus, the dream quickly changed to something more innocuous. Her success prompted her to try intervention in the emotions of others several times more, though always choosing only to try to redirect the more negative emotions of anger, fear, or once, in the case of a quarrel and a gross misunderstanding on the part of two of the court's servants, hatred. Her successes, though not always complete, were enough to encourage her in the belief that such interventions were right. There was a side effect to the complete awakening and training of her gift, and it had to do with Rolan. He was, after all, a stallion, and the premier stallion of the companion herd, and companions, like their human partners, were always in season. Rolan's company was much sought after of a night, and now that Talia's gift was at full strength, it was impossible to shield him out of her mind. The enforced sharing of Rolan's amorous encounters vastly increased her education in certain areas, even if it wasn't something she'd have chosen of her own accord. It was both curiosity and her growing sensitivity that led her to the House of Healing and the Healers' Collegium. Most of the patients there were heralds, badly injured in the field. Once their conditions had been stabilized, they were always sent here, where the combined efforts and knowledge of the kingdom's best in the healer's craft could be brought to their aid. There was not the crying need for her in the House of Healing that there had been at other times and places, but the distress was there all the same, and it drew her as a moth is drawn to flame. She was at a loss as to how to gain entrance there, until impulse caused her to seek out the one teacher she knew among the healers, the one who had treated her in her illness, Devon. Her choice couldn't have been better. Devon had been briefed by Ilsa on the nature of Talia's gift, and as an empath himself, he thoroughly understood the irresistible drawing power that the place had for her. He welcomed her presence on his rounds of his patients, guessing that she might well be able to accomplish something to aid in their recoveries. It wasn't easy, but as she had told Selene, when something needed to be done, she made the time for it. She began getting up an hour or so earlier, breakfasting in the kitchen, and making Devon's early morning rounds with him, then returning during the time in the afternoon that Elspeth spent riding with her mother. Talia learned a great deal, and not just about the healing gifts. With so many healers and healers in training available, it was not necessary for her to participate in Devon's treatments, but her observations gave her a profound respect for his abilities. His specialty, all healers had one form of healing that they studied more intensively than the others, was the kind of hurts caused by wounding, and what he referred to as trauma, injuries acquired suddenly and violently, and often accompanied by shock. Talia had never quite realized down deep until she began visiting the House of Healing just how hazardous the life of a herald could be. Until now, she'd only been aware of the deaths. Accompanying Devon, she saw what usually happened to heralds who ran afoul of ill luck on duty. "It's the border sectors that are usually the worst, you know," Devon told her when she remarked that no less than 3 of his patients seemed to be from sectors in and around her old home. "Take your home sector, for instance. The normal tour of duty for a herald is 1.5 years. Guess how long it is for the ones that ride the Holderkin sector?" "A year?" Talia hazarded. 9 or 10 months. They're fine until the winter raids coming over from Carsey. Sooner or later they catch more than an arrow or an axe, and then it's back here to recover. That's one of the worst, though some of the sectors up on the north border are just as bad, what with the barbarians coming down every time the food supply runs short. That's why we have Albrecht teaching you combat and strategy, youngling. Get assigned to a sector like the Holderkin one, and you're often as much soldier as herald. The herald in charge may well be the only trained fighter around until an army detachment arrives." Later, she asked him why it was that there wasn't anyone from the Lake Evendim area. when she knew from what Karen and Cheryl had told her that they too had their share of freebooters.
Along Lake Evandem, it isn't raiders and barbarians. It's pirates and bands of outlaws because it's easy to hide in the shore caves. Not too many injured end up here because that type of opponent isn't really out to fight, just to thieve and run. Your compatriots usually wind up getting patched up at one of the healing temples, and then they're on their way again. We don't have anyone here from southern sectors either.
Why?
Southern's abutted by Menmelith, and they're friendly. But the weather's strange and unpredictable, especially in the summer. Lots of broken bones from accidents, but there again, they're usually cared for locally unless it's something really bad, like a broken neck or back.
But there's 2 from the northwest corner, and one of them is poor Vostel. Talia shuddered a little. Vostel was burned over most of his body, and in constant agony when not sustained by drugs. Talia had taken to spending a lot of time with him because the constant pain was a drain on his emotions. He felt free to let down his frail bulwark of courage with her, to weep from the hurt, to curse the gods, to confess his fear that he would never be well again. She did her best to comfort, reassure, and give back some of the emotional energy that his injuries drained from him.
Northwest is uncanny, Devon replied. And I say it, who comes from there and should be used to it. Very odd things come out of that wilderness. And don't think I'm exaggerating, because I've seen some of them. Just as an example, 99 people out of 100 will tell you that griffins don't exist outside of a bard's fevered imagination. The 100th has been up there and seen them in the sky and knows them for the deadly reality that they are. I've seen them. I've hunted them once. They're hard to kill and impossible to catch, and dangerous, just like every weird thing that lives in that wilderness. They say there were wars once somewhere out there fought with magic. Magic, like in the bardic tales, not our gifts. And the things living out there are what's left of the weapons and armies that fought them.
What do you think? Talia asked.
It's as good a way to explain it as any, I suppose.
Devon shrugged. All I know is that most people don't believe the half of my tales.
Except the Heralds, of course. They know better. Especially after a griffin's taken a mouthful out of some of them, or a firebird scorched them for coming too close to her nest, like Vostel. That's probably why I stay here. It's the only place I'll be believed.
Talia shook her head at him. You stay because you have to. You're needed too badly here. You couldn't do anything else, and you know it.
Too wise, youngling, he replied. You're too wise by half. Maybe I should be glad. You're certainly making it easier to get my patients on their feet again. If I haven't said so before, I appreciate your efforts. We don't have enough mind healers to care for the minor traumas. The 2 we've got have to be saved for the dangerously unbalanced. Now don't look innocent. I know exactly what you've been doing. As far as I'm concerned, you can go right on doing it.
For here among the injured, she found yet another and more subtle application of her own gift. There wasn't the kind of self-destructive sorrow to deal with that came upon those left behind with the Herald's death, but there were other, more insidiously negative emotions to be transmuted. Self-doubt, so familiar to her, was one of those emotions. There wasn't a Herald in the wards that wasn't prey to it. Often they blamed themselves for their own injuries or the deaths or injuries of those they had been trying to help. And when they were alone so much of the time, with only pain and memory as companions, that self-doubt tended to grow. It was hardly surprising that some of them developed phobias either, especially not if they'd been trapped or lying alone for long periods before rescue. And there was a complex muddle of guilt and hatred to be sorted out and worked through for most of them. They hated those who had caused their hurts, either directly or indirectly, and they felt terrible guilt because a Herald was simply not supposed to hate anyone. A Herald was supposed to understand. A Herald was supposed to be the kind of person who cured hatreds, not the kind who was prey to them himself. That a Herald was also not supposed to be some kind of superhuman demigod didn't occur to them. That a little honest hatred might be healthy didn't occur to them either. But the most insidious emotion, and the hardest to do anything about, was despair. And despair was more than understandable when a body was plainly too badly hurt to be fully healed again. It sometimes happened that an injury had been left too long untended to be truly healed, especially if it had become infected. That was why Jadis had lost his leg in the wars with Carsey, fought by the Tedril mercenaries. Healers could realign even the tiniest fragments of bone to allow a crushed limb to be restored, but only if that bone had not yet begun to set. And nerve damage left too long could never be restored. How did you ease the pain of one who could look at his maimed and broken flesh and know he would never be the same again? And there was the steady toll on heart and courage inflicted by what seemed to be endless pain, pain such as the burned Vostel was enduring. All these things called to her with a voice too strong to be denied, begging her to set them aright. So, as she became more deft in the usage of her gift, she began administering to these injured as well as the bereft, and doing it so subtly that few realized that she'd helped them until after she'd gone. It was hard to find the time, hard to witness the kinds of mental torment that could not be set aright with one simple touch or an outpouring of grief, but once she began, it was impossible to stop. The needs in the House of Healing drew her as implacably as the anguish left in the wake of death did. She didn't realize, though by now Kirill and one or two others did, that she was only following in the footsteps of many other monarchs' own. Like Talia, those who had possessed the strongest gifts in that capacity wound up ministering not only to the monarch, but the entire circle as well. The mounting evidence for these few was that when Talia earned her whites, she was likely to prove to be one of the Heralds' tales are written about. Unfortunately for their peace of mind, the Heralds' tales are written about seldom had long or peaceful lives.
Chapter 12. Make sure you get the blindfold good and tight, Elspeth told Skiff. Otherwise the test isn't any good.
Skiff forbore to comment that he already knew that, and simply asked,
"Is Karen done yet?"
I'll go see.
Elspeth ran off.
"Positive you can't see anything? Too tight, too loose?"
he asked Talia, making a few final adjustments to her blindfold.
Black as a mouse hole at midnight, she assured him. And it's fine. It isn't going to slip any, I don't think, and it isn't uncomfortable. Karen says she's ready when you are,
Elspeth called from behind the screen of trees in Companion's Field where Karen stood.
"You ready?"
Any time.
Skiff led Talia carefully around the trees to where Karen stood, hands on her hips and a half-smile curving her lips.
"I took you at your word, little centaur. It's good and complicated," she said as they approached her. "Nobody's ever tried this sort of thing before, to my knowledge. It should be interesting."
Nobody seems to have this kind of companion bond either, except me, Talia replied, and I want to see how much of it is really there and how much is imagination.
"Well, this should do the trick. If you're really seeing through Roland's eyes, you won't take a single misstep. If you're only imagining it, there's no way you'll be able to negotiate this maze."
The red and gold leaves had been carefully cleaned from the ground for at least 100 feet in all directions, in front of where Karen was standing, and laid out on the grass was a carefully plotted maze, the boundaries of its corridors marked by a line of paint on the grass. The corridors were only about 2 feet wide at the most, and it would take careful watching to avoid stepping on the paint. The maze itself was, as Karen had indicated, very complicated. And since the corridors were not demarcated by anything but the paint on the grass, there would be no way the blindfolded Talia would be able to tell where they were by feel. Roland stood beside Karen, on a little rise of ground that gave him a good view of the entire maze. According to Talia's plan, he would be her eyes for this task. If the bond between them was as deep and strong as she thought, she would be able to traverse the maze with relative ease. While Karen, Skiff, and Elspeth watched in fascination, she set out to make the attempt. Halfway through, she hesitated for a long moment.
"She's going to end up in a dead end,"
Skiff whispered to Karen.
"No, she's not. Wait and see. There's more than one way you can get through this, and I think she just chose the shorter route."
Finally, Talia stopped and turned blindly back to her audience.
Well?
She asked. Take the blindfold off and see for yourself." She had threaded the maze so successfully that there wasn't even a smear of paint on her boots.
"It worked," she said, a little awed. "It really worked."
"I must admit that this is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen," Karen said, picking her way across the grass, followed by Rolan and the other two. "I thought Dantris and I were tight-bonded, but I don't think we could have managed this. Why did you stop halfway through?"
"Rolan was arguing with me. I wanted to go the way I finally did, and he wanted me to take the T path."
"Either would have gotten you out. The one you wanted was the shorter, though. Ready for the second test?"
"I think so. Rolan seems to be."
"All right, then. Off with you, despoiler of gardens." Karen slapped Rolan lightly on the rump. He snorted at her and trotted off. Skiff followed beside him. Karen had a single die, which she threw for a set of 20 passes, as Talia carefully noted down the number of pips. Skiff, with Rolan, had a set of 6 cards, one for each face of the die. Rolan was to indicate which face was up for each pass Karen made. For this time, he would be using Talia's eyes. This didn't take long. Both of them were soon back, and Skiff's and Talia's lists compared.
"Incredible!
Not even one wrong! We're going to have to tell Kirill about this. I don't doubt he'll want to give you even more tests together," Karen said with amazement.
"He's welcome if he wants to," Talia replied. "I just wanted to be sure that I was right about the bond. Now that we're done, I'll tell you what else I was testing. I was shielded the entire time for both tests."
"You're joking, surely."
Skiff's mouth fell open. "I was never more serious. You realize what this means, don't you? Not only is our bond one of the strongest I know of, but if I can't shield him out, nobody can block him away from me either."
"That could be mighty useful someday," Karen put in. "It means that even if you were unconscious, you could be reached through Rolan. We'll definitely have to tell Kirill about this now."
"Go right ahead. It's hardly something that needs to be kept secret." "Talia, do you think I'll have a friend like Rolan someday?" Elspeth asked wistfully.
Talia gathered the child to her and hugged her shoulders.
"Catling," she whispered, "never doubt it for a minute. In fact, your companion friend may very well be even better than Rolan, and that's a promise."
Rolan did not respond to this with his usual snort of human-like derision. Instead, he nuzzled the child gently, almost as if to confirm Talia's promise. A few evenings later, Talia decided to determine exactly what the physical limit of the range of her gift was. She did not bother to light a candle in her room, but simply relaxed on her bed in the growing dusk, isolating and calming any disturbing influences in herself until she was no longer aware of her body, except as a kind of anchor from which to move outward. She extended her sense of empathy slowly, reaching first beyond her room, then beyond the collegium, then beyond the palace and grounds. There were vague pockets in the palace of ambition and unease, but nothing and no one strong enough to hold her there. She brushed lightly past them, venturing beyond, out into the city itself. Emotions appeared as vivid colors to her. They were like mists to move through for the most part, with none of the negative sort being strong enough to stay her passage. Once or twice she stopped long enough to intervene, in a tavern brawl and in the nightmares of a young soldier. Then she passed on. She ranged out farther now, following the northern road, moving from contact to contact with those dwelling or camped beside it, as if she were following beacons along the wayside. They were like little lanterns along the darkened road, providing mostly guide points for her, or perhaps like stepping stones across a brook, since she needed them to move onward. The contacts here were fewer than in any other direction, as the northern road led through some of the most sparsely populated districts in the kingdom. As Talia's consciousness flowed along this route, she remembered that this was the route Ilsa had been sent out on earlier in the week. Suddenly, as if merely being reminded of Ilsa's existence were impetus enough, she found herself being pulled northward, caught by a force too strong and too urgent to resist. There was growing unease and apprehension as she was pulled along, and growing fear as well. She found herself unable to break the contact or to slow herself, and became even more alarmed because of this. She was in a near panic when she was suddenly pulled into what had drawn her. She found herself there, looking out of another's eyes. Ilsa's eyes. Ambushed. Too many. There were too many of them to fight off. Falara lashed out with wicked hooves and laid about her with her teeth, trying to make a path for escape, but their attackers were canny and managed to keep them surrounded. She clamped her legs tightly around Falara's chest to stay with her, knowing she was as good as dead if she was thrown. She drew her long sword and cut at them, but for every one she laid low, two sprang up to replace him. The sword was not really meant for fighting a horseback, and before she'd managed to strike more than half a dozen blows, it was carried out of her hands by a falling foe, and she was forced to draw her dagger instead. Then, in a well-coordinated move, they all drew back as a horn sounded. Terrible pain lanced through her shoulder and momentarily filmed her eyes. She looked down stupidly to see a feathered shaft sprouting from her upper chest. Falara screamed in agony as a second shaft pierced the companion's flank. Damn the moon! They were illuminated clearly by it, clearly enough to make good targets for the archers that must be hidden underneath the trees. Their attackers fell back a little more, and more shafts hummed out of the darkness. Falara cried once again and collapsed, trapping her beneath her companion's bulk. And she couldn't think or move, for the loss and the agony of Falara's death were all too much a part of her. The archer's work done, the swordsman closed anew. She saw the blade catch the moonlight and arc down, and knew it for the one that would kill her. "Kirill, tell the Queen! In the shaft!" Dozens of images flashed and vanished. One stayed. Arrows, ringed with black, 5 of them, hollow, black-ringed arrows. Then unbearable pain, followed by a terrifying silence and darkness, more terrible than the pain. She was trapped in the darkness, unable to escape. There was nothing to hold to, nothing to anchor to. Then, abruptly, there was something in the darkness with her. It was Rolan, and she took hold of him in panic fear and pulled. Talia shrieked with a mortal pain not her own, and found herself sitting bolt upright in her bed. For one moment she sat, blinking and confused, and not at all sure that it all hadn't been a far too realistic nightmare. Then the death bell tolled. "No! Oh, no! No! No!" She began to sob brokenly in reaction, when a thought stilled her own tears as surely as if they'd been shut off. Karen, who was bound to Ilsa as strongly as to her companion or her brother, who depended on those bonds, who, Talia knew, made a habit of communicating with her lover every night she was gone if Ilsa was within range, who must have felt Ilsa's death. If she hadn't been mentally searching for her at the time of the ambush, she would know it by the Herald's bond, and who, prostrated by grief and the shock of Ilsa's death, which she had experienced no less than Talia, might very well lose her hold on responsibility and duty long enough to succeed in death-willing herself. Talia was still dressed except for boots. She ran for the Herald's quarters without stopping to put them on. She'd never been in Karen's rooms before, but there was no mistaking the fiery beacon of pain and loss that led her onward. She followed it unerringly. The door was already open when she arrived. Karen's twin slumped next to her, his eyes dazed, his expression vacant. Karen was sitting frozen in her chair. She'd evidently been trying to reach Ilsa when Ilsa was struck down. She was totally locked away within herself. Her face was an expressionless mask, and only the wild eyes showed that she was alive. The look in those eyes was that of a creature wounded and near death, and not very human anymore. Talia touched Karen's hand hesitantly. There was no response. With a tiny cry of dismay, she took both Karen's cold hands in her own and strove to reach her with her mind. She was dragged into a whirling maelstrom of pain. There was nothing to hold on to. There was only unbearable loneliness and loss. Caught within that whirlpool was Karen's twin, and now Talia as well. Again she reached blindly in panic for a mental anchor, and again there was Rolan, a steady pillar to hold to. She reached for him, was caught and held firm. Now no longer frightened, no longer at the mercy of the pain storm, she could think of the others. Karen could not be reached, but perhaps her brother could be freed. She reached for the Terran spark, caught it, and held it long enough to try to pull both of them out. With a convulsive lurch, Talia broke contact. She found herself on the other side of the room, half supported by Taryn, half supporting him herself.
"What happened?"
she gasped.
She cried out. I heard her and found her like that. When I tried to get her to wake, when I touched her, she pulled me in with her.
Taryn shook his head, trying to clear it.
Talia, I can't reach her at all. We've got to do something. You can reach her, can't you?
I tried. I can't come near. It's too strong, too closed in. I can't catch hold of her, and she's destroying herself with her own grief. Somehow...
Talia tried to shake off the effects of her contact with that mindless chaos and loss.
Somehow I've got to find something to make her turn it outward instead of in.
Talia's chaotic thoughts steadied, found a focus and held. With one of the intuitive leaps, perhaps only she was capable of, she thought of Cheryl. Cheryl, daring to follow Karen into the river. Follow Karen. That was the key. And now Talia could remember how Cheryl had always seemed to hover at the edge of wherever it was that Karen or Ilsa or both were, and how there had always been a kind of smothered longing in her eyes. Remembered how Cheryl had always kept from intruding too closely on them, perhaps fearing that her own presence might spoil something. Cheryl, who came from the same people as Karen and Taryn, from among folk who did not hold that love between those of the same sex was anathema, as was so often the case elsewhere. Cheryl, who had as many lovers as she wished, yet stayed with none.
"Taryn, think hard. Is Cheryl back from her internship yet?"
Talia asked him urgently.
I think so.
He was still a little dazed.
"Get her then, now. She'll know who the bell is for. Tell her Karen needs her."
He did not pause to question her, impelled by the urgency in her voice. He scrambled to his feet and sprinted out the door. Talia returned to Karen's side and strove to touch her without being pulled in a second time. Finally, the sound she'd been hoping for reached her ears, the sound of 2 pairs of feet running up the corridor. Cheryl led Taryn by a good margin, and she plainly had only one goal in her mind, Karen. Talia relinquished her place as Cheryl seized Karen's hands in her own and knelt by her side, sobbing heartbrokenly, calling Karen's name. The sound of her weeping penetrated Karen's blankness as nothing Talia had tried had done. Her voice, or perhaps the unconcealed love in that voice, and the pain that equaled Karen's own, broke the hold Karen's grief had held over her. Karen's face stirred, came to life again. Her eyes went to the woman kneeling beside her.
"Cheryl,"
Karen whispered hoarsely. Something else came forward from the back of her mind, and Talia remembered one thing more, Ilsa saying, sometimes persistent inability can mask ability, and Cheryl's own disclaimer of any but the most rudimentary abilities at thought-reading. Before the wave of their combined grief, and her need to find and give comfort, Cheryl's mental walls collapsed. Taryn and Talia removed themselves and shut the door, giving them privacy to vent their sorrows, but not alone anymore, and not facing their grief unsupported. Talia leaned up against the corridor walls, wanting to dissolve helplessly into tears herself.
Talia.
Taryn touched her elbow lightly.
"Goddess! Oh, Taryn, I saw her die. I saw Ilsa die. It was horrible."
Tears were coursing down her face, and yet this wasn't the kind of weeping that brought any relief. Other heralds were beginning to gather around her. She hadn't had any time to reshield, and their raw emotions melded painfully with her own. It felt as if she were being smothered or torn into dozens of little pieces and scattered on the wind. Herald Kirill, a tall man considerably older than Taryn, and accompanied by the Queen, pushed his way to Talia's side and caught hold of one of her hands. With that contact, he managed to shield her mind from the others. It gave her some respite, though the relief was only partial. He could not shield her from her own memories.
"Majesty," he exclaimed, "this is the other presence I sensed."
Selene exercised her royal prerogatives and ordered the corridor cleared.
"Kirill,"
she said when only Talia remained,
"it is possible that she may have the answer. Her gift is empathy, to be as one with the person she touches."
Talia nodded to confirm what Selene said, her face wet, her throat too choked to speak.
"My lady, The iron-haired herald had something about him that commanded her instant attention. "You may be the key to a terrible dilemma. I hear the thoughts of others, it is true, but only as words. Ilsa cast a message to me with her last breath, but it means nothing to me, nothing. But if you can recall her thoughts, you who shared her mind, you alone know the meaning behind those words on the wind. Can you tell us what she meant?"
Those final images sprang all too readily to mind, invoking the rest of the experience. "The arrows!" she gasped, feeling Ilsa's death throes in every cell of her own body. "The black-ringed arrows she carried are metal, hollow. What you want is inside them." "In the shaft, of course," Selene breathed. "She meant the arrow shaft." Talia closed her hands over her aching temples. She wished passionately that she could somehow hide in the darkness behind her eyes.
"Kyril, are Chris and Dirk in residence?" Selene demanded.
"Yes, Majesty."
"Then we have a chance to snatch what Ilsa won for us before anyone has an opportunity to find it. Talia, I must ask still more of you. Come with me. Kyril, find Chris and Dirk and bring them with you."
Selene half ran down the hall. Talia was forced to ignore her pounding head and urge her trembling legs into a sprint to keep up with her. They left the collegium area entirely and entered the portion of the palace reserved for the royal family, a portion of the area dating right back to Valdemar and the founding. The Queen opened the door on a room scarcely larger than a closet, round and with a round table in the center. It was lit by one lantern, heavily shaded, suspended from the ceiling above the exact center of the table. Beneath it, resting on a padded base, was a sphere of crystal. The table itself was surrounded by padded benches with backs to them. As the door closed behind them, the dead feeling to the room showed that it was so well insulated against outside noise that a small riot could take place outside the door without the occupants of the room being aware of it. It was no longer possible to hear even the grim tolling of the death bell. Talia sank onto one of the benches, holding her furiously aching temples and closing her eyes against the light. Her respite was short-lived. The door opened again. Talia raised aching lids to see that Kyril had brought 2 more heralds with him, both dressed in clothing that showed every evidence of being thrown on with extreme haste. With a pang, Talia recognized Dirk and had no difficulty in identifying the angelically beautiful Chris. They took the bench to her left, Chris sitting closest to her. Kyril sat to her immediate right, and Selene next to him.
"Talia,"
Kyril said,
"I want you to retrace where you sent your mind tonight. I think perhaps there will be enough emotional residue for you to find it again. This is not going to be easy for you. It will require every last bit of your strength, and I think I can predict that what you will find there may be even more distressing than what you already know. I'll try and cushion the effects for you, but since your gift is tied up with emotions and feelings, it's bound to be painful. Chris will be following you with his sight. Put your hand in his and don't let go until we tell you to. Dirk will be linked with him, and the Queen will be shielding all 4 of us from the outside world and the thoughts of others and keeping distractions from us."
As he spoke, Kyril took Talia's unresisting right hand into his own. She had no energy to spare to reply. She simply leaned back into the padded support of the bench back and put herself back into the interrupted trance. The pain of her head interfered with that. There was a whisper, and a hand rested for a brief moment on the one resting in Chris's. "Selene," her mind recognized absently, and the pain receded. She retraced her movements now with a kind of double inner vision, seeing the swirls of emotion she had followed, and seeing the actual landmarks with Chris's gift as well. Darkness did not hamper his sight in the least, for everything seemed to be illuminated from within, living things the most. Time lost meaning. Then, as she began to recognize things she had passed, she began to dread what she would find at the end of the journey. Finding the site of the ambush again was probably the worst experience she had ever had in her life. Ilsa's body had been searched, with complete and callous thoroughness. She was only grateful that it was not Karen who was linked in with her, to see the bestial things they'd done to her life-mate. She wanted to retch, started to feel her grasp on the place slip, then felt someone else's strength supporting her. She held to her task, until she began to lose herself as her strength faded. She couldn't feel her own body anymore, even remotely. A luminous mist began to obscure her inner vision. She knew she should have been frightened, for she had gone beyond the limits of her own abilities and energies and was in grave danger of being lost, but she could not even summon up enough force to be afraid. Then, for the third time, she felt Rolan with her, adding his energy to her own, and she held on for far longer than she would have thought anyone would have been able to bear. Then she heard Chris's voice say, "Got it," and felt him loose her hand.
"Your part's over, Talia,"
Kirill murmured. She fled back to herself in a rush, and with a tiny sob of release, she buried her head in her arms on the table and let the true tears of mourning flow at last. She wept in silence, only the shaking of her shoulders betraying her. The attention of the others was directed elsewhere now, and she felt free to let her grief loose. Something clattered down onto the table with a faint metallic clash. The sound was repeated 4 more times. Dirk's voice, harsh with fatigue, said,
"That's the lot."
There was a stirring to her right, a sound of metal grating on metal, and the whisper of paper. There was utter silence. Then the Queen sighed. Her bench grated a little on the floor as she stood.
"This is the proof I needed,"
she said grimly.
"I must summon the council. There will be necks in the noose after this night's work. High-born necks."
There was a whisper of cooler air from the door, and she was gone. Talia felt Kirill rise beside her.
"My place is at the council board to represent the circle,"
he said, then hesitated.
"Go, Kirill,"
Chris replied in answer to his hesitation.
"We'll see to her."
He sighed with relief, obviously having been torn between his responsibilities to Talia and to the circle.
"Bless you, brothers. Talia."
His hand rested briefly on her head.
"You are more than worthy to be Queen's own. This would not have been remotely possible without your help. Oh, damn. Words mean less than nothing now. You'll learn soon enough what this night's agony has won for all of us in the way of long overdue justice. I think Ilsa would be proud of you."
The door sighed. He was gone.
"Talia?"
Someone had taken Kirill's place on her right. The voice was Dirk's. She stemmed the flood of tears with an effort and regained at least a fragile semblance of control over herself. Surreptitiously drying her eyes on her sleeve, she raised her aching head. The weariness on both their faces matched her own, and there were tears in Chris's eyes and the marks of weeping on Dirk's cheeks as well. Both of them tried to reach out of their own grief to comfort her, but were not really sure what to say.
"I think I'd like to go back to my room,"
she said carefully, between surges of pain. Her head throbbed in time with her pulse, and her vision faded every time the pain worsened. She tried to stand, but as she did so, the chamber spun around her like a top. The lamplight dimmed, and there was a roaring in her ears. Chris shoved the table out of the way so that she wouldn't crack her skull open on it, while Dirk knocked over the bench in his haste to reach her before she fell. Then everything seemed to fade, even her own body, and her thoughts vanished in the wave of anguish that followed. It was Ilsa, and Falara with her. At least Talia thought it was Falara. The companion didn't look the same from moment to moment, a fascinating and luminous, eternally shifting form, and where they were. It was sort of a ghost of her own room, all gray and shadowy, insubstantial. You could see the moon and the stars through the walls. "Elsa?" she said doubtfully, for the Herald looked scarcely older than herself.
"Kitten,"
Ilsa replied, her tone a benediction.
"Oh, kitten, you won't remember this clearly, but you will remember it. Tell Karen not to grieve too long. Tell her I said so. And if she doesn't behave herself and take what Sherry's offering, I'll come haunt her. The darkness isn't the end to everything, kitten. The havens are beyond it, and I'm overdue. But before I go, I have a few things to tell you and to give you."
She woke the next morning with burning eyes and a still pounding skull, yet with an oddly comforted soul. There had been a dream, or was it a dream? Ilse, no longer the mutilated, ravaged thing Talia had seen, but miraculously restored and somehow younger-looking, had spoken to her. She'd seemed awfully substantial for a ghost, if indeed that was what she was. She'd spoken with Talia for a long, long time. Some things she'd said were so clear that Talia could almost hear them now. What to tell Karen, for instance, when Karen's grief had ebbed somewhat, to make it clear to Sherry that she was not to consider herself an interloper. Then she'd taken Talia's hand in her own and done... what? She couldn't remember exactly. But somehow the anguish of last night had been replaced by a gentle sorrow that was much easier to bear. The memories, too, those that were her own, were still crystal clear, but those which had been Ilse's were blurred, set at one remove, and no longer so agonizingly a part of her. She couldn't remember now what it had felt like to die. Someone had removed her outer tunic, tucked her into bed wearing her loose shirt and breeches. As she sat up, nausea joined the ache in her skull and her temples throbbed. The symptoms were very easy to recognize. After all, she'd badly overtaxed herself. Now she was paying the price. Ilse had said something about that too in the dream. She dragged herself out of bed and went to the desk, only to discover that someone had anticipated her need, readying a mug of Ilse's herbal remedy and putting a kettle of water over the tiny fire on her pocket-sized hearth. She needed only to pour the hot water over the crushed botanicals and wait for them to steep. She counted to 100, slowly, then drank the brew off without bothering to sweeten or strain it. When the pounding in her head had subsided a bit and her stomach had settled, she sought the bathing room. A long, hot bath was also part of the prescription, and she soaked for at least an hour. By then her headache had receded to manageable proportions, and she dressed in clean clothing and descended to the kitchen. Miro was working like a fiend possessed, his round face displaying a grief as deep as any Herald's. He greeted her appearance with an exclamation of surprise. She soon found herself tucked into a corner of the kitchen with another mug of the herb tea in one hand and a slice of honey cake to kill the taste in another. "Has anything happened since last night?" she asked, knowing that Miro heard everything as soon as it transpired.
"Not a great deal," he replied. But they brought her home in the dawn."
His face crumpled for a moment, and Talia remembered belatedly that Miro and Ilse had been long-time friends, that he had adopted her much as he had taken Elspeth as a special pet in Ilse's long-ago student days. "And Karen?" she asked, hesitating to intrude on his grief.
"She is coping. Is better than I would have expected. That was a wise thing, a kind thing that you did, to bring to her side one who could most truly feel and share in her loss and sorrow," he replied, giving her a look of sad approval. "The Book of One says that love is most true that thinks first of the pain of others before its own. She, the lady, she must be proud of you, I think."
He stumbled to a halt, not knowing what else to say. "I hope she is, Miro," Talia replied with sincerity. "What of the Queen, and the Council, and Terran?"
"Terran helps Cheryl to tend his sister. He seems well enough. I think it is enough for him to know that she is safe again. Oh, and Cheryl has been ordered to bide at the Collegium until this newly woken gift of hers be properly trained. Kirill himself is to tend to that. As for the rest, the Council are still closeted together. There was some coming and going of the palace guard in the hour before dawn, however. Rumor says that there are some high-born ones missing from their beds. But you do not eat."
He frowned at her, and she hastily began to nibble at the cake.
"She told me long ago that those who spend much of themselves in magic must soon replace what they spent or suffer as a consequence."
He stood over her until she'd finished, then pressed another slice into her hand. "It's so quiet," she said, suddenly missing the sound of feet and voices that usually filled the Collegium. "Where is everybody?"
"In the Great Hall, waiting on the word from the Council. Perhaps you should be there as well."
No. I don't think I need to be, she replied, closing weary eyes. Now that my head is working again, I know what the decisions will be. Whether she'd sorted out the confused memories alone, or with the aid of someone, or something else, she knew now what it was that Ilse had died to obtain. It was nothing less than the proofs, written in their own hands, of treason against Selene, and murder of many of the heralds by 5 of the court's highly placed nobles. These were the incontrovertible proofs that the Queen had long desired to obtain, and 2 of the nobles named in those letters were previously unsuspected, and both were council members. There would be no denying their own letters. Before nightfall, the heart and soul of the conspiracy begun by the Queen's husband would be destroyed, root and branch. These documents, hidden in the hollow arrows and transported to the dim chamber of the palace by Dirk and Chris, would be the instruments of vengeance for Ilse herself, and Talimir, and many another herald whose names Talia didn't even know. How Ilse had obtained these things, Talia had no idea, nor, with the effect of the drug she'd been drinking finally taking hold, did she much care. She began to doze a little, her head nodding, when the death bell suddenly ceased its tolling. She woke at the sudden silence. Then other bells began ringing, the bells that only rang to announce vital decisions made by the council. They were tolling a death knell. Miro nodded, as if to himself.
The council has decided. The Queen has confirmed it. They have chosen the death sentence, he said. They will probably grant the condemned ones the right to die by their own hands, but if they have not the courage, the executioner will have them in the morning. I wish... His face registered both grief and fury. It is not the way of the one, may he forgive me, but I could wish they had 12 lives each, that they might truly pay for what they did, and I wish that it could be I who metes out that vengeance to them.
Talia briefly closed her eyes on his raw grief, then took up the task of easing it. The petals falling from the apple trees were a match for Roland's coat and the pristine state of Skiff's traveling leathers.
Do I look that different?
He asked Talia anxiously.
I mean, I don't feel any different.
I'm afraid you do look different, she told him with a perfectly straight face. Like someone else altogether?
How?
Well, to tell you the absolute truth, she muted her voice as if she were giving him the worst of bad news. You look...
What? What?
Responsible. Serious. Adult.
Talia!
No, really, you don't look any different. She giggled. All it looks like is that you fell into a vat of bleach and your greys got accidentally upgraded.
Oh, Talia!
He joined her laughter for a while, then grew serious.
I'll miss you.
I'll miss you too.
They walked together in silence through the falling blossoms. It was Skiff who finally broke the silence between them.
At least I won't be as worried about you now, not like I'd have been if I'd gone last fall.
Worried? About me? Why? What is there to be worried about here?
For one thing, you're safer now. There isn't anybody left to be out after your blood. For another, well, I don't know why, but before, you never seemed to belong here. Now you do.
Now I feel like I've earned my place here, that's all.
You never needed to earn it.
I thought I did.
They drew within sight of the tack shed, where Skiff's companion Simri waited, and with her, his internship instructor Dirk.
Promise me something.
What?
You won't forget how to laugh?
He grinned. If you'll promise me that you'll learn.
Clown.
Pedant.
Scoundrel.
Shrew.
Then, unexpectedly,
You're the best friend I'll ever have.
Her throat suddenly closed with tears. Unable to speak, she buried her face in his shoulder, holding him as tightly as she could. A few moments later, she noticed he was doing the same.
Just look at us,
she managed to get out.
A pair of great blubbering babies.
All in a good cause.
He wiped his eyes on his sleeve.
Talia, I really do have something I'd like to ask you before I leave. Something I'd like you to do.
Anything,
she managed to grin. "So long as it's not going to get me in too much trouble."
"Well, I never had any family, at least not that I know of. Would you be my family, my sister, since it doesn't seem like we were meant to be anything else?"
"Oh, Skiff, she swallowed. "Nothing would make me happier, not even getting my weights. I don't have any family anymore either, but you're worth 12 holds all by yourself."
"Then just like we used to on the street?"
He solemnly nicked his wrist and handed her his knife. She followed suit, and they held their wrists together.
"Blood to blood, till death binding," he whispered.
"And after," she replied.
"And after."
He tore his handkerchief in half and bound up both their wrists.
"It's time, I guess. If I dally around much more, Dirk's going to be annoyed. Well, take care."
"Be very careful out there, promise. If you manage to get yourself hurt, I'll turn Albrecht loose on you."
"Lord of lights, you are vicious, aren't you?"
He turned toward her and caught her in a fierce hug that nearly squeezed all the breath from her lungs, then planted a hard, quick kiss on her lips and ran off toward his waiting mentor. As he ran, he looked back over his shoulder, waving farewell. She waved after him until he was completely out of sight. She was unaware that she was being watched.
"And off goes her last friend,"
Selene sighed, guilt in her eyes.
"I think not,"
Kirill replied from just behind her. They had just turned their own companions loose and had been walking together slowly back to the palace. The gentle warmth and the perfumed rain of blossoms had made both of them reluctant to return to duty. Kirill had spotted Talia first. They'd turned aside into a copse to avoid disturbing what was obviously meant to be a private farewell.
"Why?"
Selene asked.
"Lady knows she's little enough time for making friends."
"She doesn't have to make them. They make themselves her friends. As little as I see the trainees, I've noticed that. And it isn't just the younglings. There's Karen, Cheryl, even Albrecht."
"Enough to hold her here without regret. We've stolen her childhood, Kirill. We've made her a woman in a child's body and forced responsibilities on her an adult would blanch at."
"We steal all their childhoods, lady. It comes with being chosen."
He sighed.
"There isn't one of us who's had the opportunity to truly be a child. Responsibility comes on us all early. As to Talia, she never really had a childhood to steal. Her own people saw to that."
"It isn't fair."
"Life isn't fair. Even so, given the chance to choose, she'd take being chosen over any other fate. I know I would. Don't you think she's happier with us than she would be anywhere else?"
"If I could only be sure of that."
"Then watch her. You'll see."
Talia stared as long as anything of Skiff and his mentor could be seen, then turned back toward the collegium. As she turned, Selene could clearly see her face. With no one watching her, she had erected no barriers. As she turned away, her pensive expression lightened until, as she faced the collegium, most of the sorrow of parting had left her eyes. And Selene's heart lifted again as she read all Kirill had promised she would find in those eyes. Talia sighed, turning back toward the collegium. As she did so, she felt Rolan reaching tentatively for her. For one long moment after Skiff had vanished off on his own, she had felt bereft and terribly lonely. But now, how could she ever be lonely when there was Rolan? And Skiff wasn't the only friend she had. Jerry was off somewhere, but Cheryl was still here, and Karen, Devon, little Elspeth, Selene, even dear, overly gallant Griffin. They were all of them more than friends. They were kin, the important kind, soul kindred, her family, her real family. This was where she'd belonged all along. As she'd told Skiff, it had just taken her this long to see it. And with a lighter heart, she turned back down the path that led to the collegium. The collegium and home. This concludes Arrows of the Queen by Mercedes Lackey, narrated by Christa Lewis. Copyright 1987 by Mercedes R. Lackey. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Daw Books Incorporated and was produced in the year 2018 by Tantor Media Incorporated, a division of Recorded Books, which holds the copyright thereto. Please visit tantor.com for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks.